South Park spent 27 years turning Eric Cartman into the world's most infamous fat kid. Then Ozempic entered the story. Cereal mascots became armed cartel killers, insurance companies became villains, and Kyle made a shocking promise at school. The show tackled weight, health, and society in the only way South Park could. In this video, we break down South Park's battle with Ozempic and obesity. Cartman's weight, 27 years of the same joke. Late summer of 1997, Comedy Central was still a relatively young cable network trying to find its place in American television. It had been formed in 1991 from the merger of two smaller comedy-focused channels, and for most of its first 6 years, it had filled airtime with reruns, stand-up specials, and imported British programming rather than original shows it could call entirely its own. Cable was expanding fast in those years. Viewer habits were changing. Networks needed identity, something that would make an audience think of them by name rather than stumble across them while looking for something else. Comedy Central needed a show that belonged to it. On August 13th of that year, that show arrived. 4 paper-cut animated boys from a small mountain town in Colorado made their television debut on a channel that was, by most accounts, a little surprised by the attention that followed. South Park was crude, loud, and startling from the very first scene, and one of the 4 boys who anchored it was, without any possible ambiguity, fat. Eric Cartman was round in a way the animation made impossible to miss, where the other 3 boys were roughly proportional to how animated children were usually drawn at the time. Cartman was wider and heavier at every edge. His winter coat was puffier, his face sat inside a circle of cheek that made him look, from certain angles, like a very small man who had been inflated slightly past his natural size. The show did not wait long to direct attention to this. His friends commented on his body within the first few episodes. His weight was mentioned in dialogue, built into visual gags, and woven into the fabric of what the show was doing from almost the beginning. None of it was subtle. Comedy Central in 1997 was not a network particularly interested in subtlety, and neither were the 2 young men in Colorado who had created the thing. Trey Parker and Matt Stone were 20-something filmmakers who had come up through extreme provocation with their earlier short film work, and South Park was both a continuation of that instinct and a new canvas for it. Cartman's body was part of the provocation from the first frame. Just 2 weeks after the premiere, the show aired what would become the first episode dedicated largely to Cartman's weight. Weight Gain 4000, the 3rd episode in the series, which premiered on August 27th of that same year, took the visual joke and built an entire story around it. Cartman had somehow won an environmental essay contest, apparently by copying an existing text and writing his name on it, and was preparing for the celebrity visit that would accompany his award presentation. Wanting to look good for the cameras, he discovered a late-night television product called Weight Gain 4000, the kind of aggressively marketed protein supplement that was a fixture of cable television in the 1990s. The product promised rapid muscular transformation. Cartman consumed it as aggressively as possible, working through an enormous quantity in what the show depicted as a matter of days. The outcome was not muscular transformation, but something well beyond his already substantial starting point. He ballooned. By the middle of the episode, he had become too heavy to leave his house, and ended up appearing on a parody of a daytime talk show, sitting in a reinforced chair while maintaining, with complete conviction, that all the weight he had gained was pure muscle. Kyle Broflovsky delivered one of the most frequently repeated lines from the show's early run during this episode, a detailed riff on Cartman's body that concluded with the observation that when Cartman walked down the street, people stopped to remark out loud on his size. A passerby, appearing exactly on cue, did precisely that. Cartman denied everything. Cartman's standing denial of his own weight became the engine of the joke for years. The position he held across season after season was that he was not fat in any meaningful sense. He was big-boned. His family had always been large-framed people. His size was a matter of genetics and constitution, rather than anything that could reasonably be criticized. When called fat, he responded with what the show framed as personal outrage. Not performed irritation for effect, but the specific kind of feeling that comes from hearing something one simply refuses to accept. Kyle became the most reliable deliverer of the insult across the show's early seasons. Their dynamic around it became one of the show's most durable recurring elements. Kyle would call Cartman fat, Cartman would deny it, the exchange would end in stalemate, and the same exchange would happen again in a later episode. Over enough repetition, the rhythm became familiar before it even arrived. The show was using recognition as part of the joke, letting audiences enjoy the beat they knew was coming before it landed. This cycle repeated many times across many seasons, becoming shorthand for the relationship between those 2 characters, a running argument that neither of them was ever going to resolve. Understanding why those jokes jokes kept working for as long as they did requires paying some attention to what the show was doing with Cartman beyond the fat gag itself. He was not written as a sympathetic figure who happened to be overweight. He was written as one of the most comprehensively unpleasant characters in animated television history. Selfish, manipulative, casually racist, and capable of cruelty that escalated season by season into something the show's writers seemed to find increasingly interesting to explore. His willingness to lie, scheme, humiliate, and harm people around him for personal gain was consistent across every season the show produced. The fat jokes existed alongside all of that, and the show's visual and narrative logic treated the two things as connected. Being fat, in the way the show framed Cartman in those early seasons, was one entry on a list of unflattering truths about the character. His body was one more signal that things were not right with him. Whether that was a defensible way to build a comedy character is a question that gets more complicated the longer one sits with it. But in the late 1990s, Parker and Stone were not pausing to ask it. The jokes came fast, they landed hard, and the audience kept watching. Season 4 brought the episode that gave Cartman's weight its most sustained and direct examination up to that point. Fat Camp, which aired in December of 2000, opened with an intervention. Cartman's mother Leanne, accompanied by family members and friends of the family, had gathered in the living room to tell Cartman that his weight had become a real health concern and that he was being sent to a weight loss camp. The scene followed the template of the intervention format that had become familiar through afternoon television. The gathered loved ones, the prepared statements, the confrontation with someone who does not want to hear what is being said. Cartman responded exactly as the audience expected. He reached for the big-boned argument. He looked to his mother for the corroboration she had always provided, the backing of the family frame story that had kept the big-boned defense alive for years. Leanne Cartman in this episode did not provide that corroboration. She told her son plainly that what she had been saying was not true. All of it, the big-boned explanations, the genetic framing, the family-size mythology, she had invented it to protect him. The actual answer, delivered without much ceremony, was that he was just fat. Nothing more complicated than that. Something about that scene landed differently than a simple insult would have. For 4 seasons, the fat joke had been framed as a thing Kyle said to Cartman, an accusation, a provocation, something Cartman could argue back against and the audience could watch him deny. That framing kept a certain distance intact. The joke existed between two characters, and one of those characters was actively resisting it. When Leanne said it, that distance collapsed. She was not Cartman's adversary. She was the one person whose opinion of him was never really in doubt. Her protection of the fiction, for 4 seasons, had given him somewhere to stand when the jokes came. Losing that protection meant losing the ground beneath the denial. The show played the moment with its usual comedic speed, not letting it settle into anything too heavy, but the mechanism beneath it was visible. A child had been told a comfortable lie for years, and the lie had not done him any real good. The truth had been available the whole time, and the kindness of hiding it had simply delayed the moment of contact. At the camp itself, Cartman proved characteristically resourceful in ways that had nothing to do with losing weight. He arranged to have a lookalike take his place in the supervised activities while he pursued other interests elsewhere, paying another kid to attend sessions in his name while he operated freely outside the camp's constraints. When the arrangement was eventually discovered, it landed more as a Cartman being Cartman moment than as a genuine reckoning with anything. He finished the episode essentially unchanged, having found a way to extract whatever advantage the situation offered without engaging with its stated purpose. This was a template the show would return to repeatedly over the years. Cartman encountering a situation that invited or required growth, locating the exit before anything meaningful could happen, and returning to form by the end. His body was built into that pattern. The show seemed, consciously or not, to be making a structural commitment with every episode that left Cartman exactly as large as he had been at the start. His weight was a feature of the character's fundamental permanence, and that permanence was part of how the joke stayed alive across so many seasons. Across the show's middle seasons, as the comedy grew more politically complex and the targets multiplied, Cartman's weight receded from the center of his characterization without fully disappearing. The character had developed into something richer and stranger than a simple fat kid joke could contain. Episodes throughout seasons 5 through 12 demonstrated what the show was capable of when it leaned into Cartman's capacity for manipulation and cruelty rather than his physical appearance. Scott Tenorman Must Die, which aired in season 5, tends to be the episode mentioned when people discuss where the character became something alarming rather than simply obnoxious. The scheme Cartman executed in that episode, and the lengths he was willing to go to achieve what he wanted, generated discussion well beyond the usual South Park audience. His body body had nothing to do with it. His personality was carrying the weight of the story entirely. Through this period, the weight jokes were still present. Kyle could still be counted on for the occasional remark. Cartman still denied everything, but the show had demonstrated that the character could be funny and disturbing and interesting without the fat gag being the headline. He was the fat kid. The show had quietly found that he was also a great deal more than that. Raising the Bar, the 9th episode of season 16, and the 232nd episode of the series overall, brought Cartman's weight back into direct focus in a way that reflected how much the cultural conversation around obesity had shifted by 2012. The episode began at a Walmart, where Kyle warned Cartman that his future, if he kept going the way he was going, was one of those mobility scooters that heavier-bodied shoppers were using throughout the store. Rather than being scared straight by this prediction, Cartman paused, admitted to Kyle that he was fat, the first clear admission of the truth after 15 seasons of denial, and then immediately used that admission to game the system. He gained additional weight on purpose, enough to qualify for a mobility scooter covered by his mother's insurance company, and arrived at school the following episode with a scooter of his own. He claimed to be advocating for the dignity of obese people everywhere while shamelessly exploiting every accommodation that classification entitled him to access. The episode won the 2013 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. It was also, in retrospect, the moment where the show most directly connected Cartman's obesity to the logic of insurance coverage, a connection that would come roaring back 12 years later in a very different episode with a very different kind of villain. That episode's release coincided with a moment when the broader cultural conversation about weight was changing in ways the show could not entirely ignore. The body positivity movement, which had roots in the fat acceptance activism that first organized in the late 1960s, was becoming a genuine mainstream presence by the early 2010s. Organizations like the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, founded in 1969, had been campaigning for the rights of larger-bodied people for decades, in relative obscurity. Social media changed the reach of those arguments. Instagram gave activists, musicians, and public figures a platform to challenge the assumption that larger bodies were automatically problems requiring solutions, and the movement found an audience far beyond the advocacy circles that had originally built it. The language around weight was shifting. Cultural permission structures for fat jokes were becoming more complicated. South Park did not change its fundamental approach in response to any of this. It kept making the jokes. It kept deploying the familiar insults, but those jokes were operating in a different context than they had been in 1997, and some of the ease with which they had once landed was harder to locate. Into the show's later seasons, the rhythms held well enough. Kyle still delivered the insult on occasion, Cartman still responded with denial or deflection, the fat ass label was still in circulation, still recognizable as shorthand for a dynamic the audience had been watching for over 2 decades. By the time the end of Obesity was announced in the spring of 2024, South Park had been on the air for 27 years, and had produced well over 300 episodes without ever quite resolving the central question that the Cartman fat joke raised. Was his weight something the show thought was funny in itself? A simple visual gag about a round character? Or was it something the show was using to say something more complicated about a character whose failings ran much deeper than his body? Both had always been at least partly true. The ambiguity was functional. It kept the joke available at more than one level, and it kept audiences from having to decide exactly what they were laughing at when they laughed at it. In May of 2024, something happened before the end of Obesity had played a single second of story. The show replaced its standard opening disclaimer with a new one, informing viewers they were about to hear the actual sounds of Trey Parker injecting himself with semaglutide in real life. Parker, one of the 2 men who had built this show and kept it running for nearly 3 decades, was taking the drug that the episode was about to satirize. This was not a throwaway bit, it was a signal about where the episode was going. For 27 years, the show had kept Cartman's weight at a comfortable distance, a joke about a cartoon character, something that lived safely inside the fiction. Now the line between the show and the people making it had moved. Parker was injecting himself with the drug that Cartman was desperate to access. The story that followed was not going to be what anyone familiar with 27 years of the same fat joke might have expected. The cereal mascots were coming. The insurance system was about to be named as the villain. And Kyle, who had been calling Cartman a fat ass since the 3rd episode of the 1st season in August of 1997, was going to stand up in a school cafeteria and apologize for all of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 27 years of the same joke, and the character never changed his shape once. Coming up, the drug that finally gave the show something new to point at. where Ozempic actually came from, how the science behind it works, and why a diabetes medication quietly became the most talked about substance in the world. Section 2. What Cartman's doctor is actually talking about, the real science of Ozempic. When the doctor in the special runs through the list of weight loss drugs available to Cartman, the names he mentions are real. Ozempic, Wegovy, semaglutide, these are not invented for the episode. The doctor's explanation of what they do is also real, stripped down to fit the pace of a comedy special, but not wrong. And when Cartman's mother asks about cost, and the doctor explains that insurance will not cover it because Cartman does not have diabetes, that is real too. Parker and Stone did not need to exaggerate the pharmaceutical situation to make the satire work. The situation as it exists was already absurd enough that depicting it accurately produced the same result. Understanding what semaglutide actually is, where it came from, and what it does in the body is the first step toward understanding why an entire town in a cartoon would go to war over access to it. GLP-1 stands for glucagon-like peptide 1, a hormone the human body produces naturally in cells lining the small intestine. When food arrives in the digestive system, those cells release GLP-1 into the bloodstream. The hormone then does several things at once. It signals the pancreas to release insulin in response to rising blood sugar. It slows the rate at which the stomach empties its contents into the small intestine, extending the physical sensation of fullness. And it activates receptors in specific areas of the brain involved in appetite regulation, reducing the drive to seek and eat food. The problem with the body's own GLP-1 is its duration. Natural GLP-1 breaks down within minutes of being released. The appetite suppression it causes is brief, the satiety signal fades quickly, and the drive to eat returns. What pharmaceutical researchers had been trying to build since the 1980s was a version of this hormone that stayed active long enough to be therapeutically useful, something that could sustain the satiety signal over hours or days rather than minutes. Researchers studying the Gila monster, a venomous lizard native to the American Southwest, discovered a compound in its saliva that became one of the most important leads in this search. The compound, called exendin-4, mimicked the effects of human GLP-1, but resisted the enzymatic breakdown that made the natural hormone so short-lived. The Gila monster eats infrequently. In the wild, it may consume only a few meals per year, and its metabolic systems are built for slow, sustained energy extraction from occasional food intake. The long-acting GLP-1 mimic in its saliva was part of that biological architecture. Scientists recognized exendin-4 as a model for what they were trying to engineer, and used it as the basis for the first GLP-1 receptor agonist approved for human use in type 2 diabetes, exenatide, which reached the market in 2005 requiring twice-daily injections. The Gila monster's metabolic biology contributed directly to the drug class that would, nearly 20 years later, become the subject of a South Park special. Novo Nordisk, a Danish pharmaceutical company with over a century of history in diabetes care, beginning with its foundational insulin work, spent the 1990s and 2000s building toward a longer-acting version of the same concept. The company's approach involved taking the structure of natural human GLP-1 and attaching a fatty acid chain to the molecule. This chain allowed the modified compound to bind to albumin proteins in the bloodstream, which dramatically slowed the rate at which the body broke it down. The resulting molecule, semaglutide, had a half-life of approximately 160 hours, roughly 6.5 days, which made once-weekly dosing clinically viable. A patient injects on the same day each week and maintains consistent drug levels throughout that period. Achieving the fatty acid chain at the right length and configuration to produce the albumin binding without impairing the molecule's ability to activate GLP-1 receptors took years of iterative chemistry. When the FDA approved semaglutide as Ozempic in December 2017 for the treatment of type 2 diabetes, it was the result of decades of work that had started with a Gila monster's unusual relationship with food. Suppressing appetite through the brain is the part of the mechanism that separates semaglutide from the weight loss drugs that came before it, and explains why the results were so dramatically different. The South Park special depicts Cartman immediately fantasizing about being thin, imagining the social freedom a slimmer body would give him. What the show does not depict, because it is not a medical documentary, is the specific subjective experience patients describe when the drug begins working. The most consistently reported change is the disappearance of what users call food noise, the constant background mental activity around eating that drives most people's day. The low-grade, persistent pull toward food. The thoughts about what the next meal will be, when it will arrive, and what it will contain. Patients who have spent years managing their weight describe this mental noise as something they did not realize was there until the drug removed it. GLP-1 receptors are present not just in the pancreas and stomach, but in areas of the brain involved involved in reward, motivation, and appetite regulation. Semaglutide activates those receptors directly. The drug changes the signal from the brain, not just the stomach. Semaglutide's first FDA approval was for type 2 diabetes, not obesity, and this distinction is the source of the insurance problem the special depicts. As a diabetes medication, Ozempic, at its approved dose of 1 milligram per week, lowered blood sugar in type 2 diabetic patients, reduced the risk of major cardiovascular events, and caused patients to lose weight as a secondary effect. The weight loss was real, documented, and discussed in medical literature, but it was a secondary finding attached to a diabetes indication, not an approved obesity treatment. Insurance coverage for diabetes medication is standard. Insurance coverage for weight loss medication is historically the opposite of standard. This single regulatory distinction, the drug approved for diabetes producing weight loss as a side effect versus the drug approved for obesity producing weight loss as its primary purpose, is what determines whether Cartman's mother can get coverage. The doctor is not inventing an insurance barrier. He is describing one that exists precisely because of how and when the drug was approved and what diagnosis code appears on the claim. Clinical data from the STEP trials changed the picture for what semaglutide could do specifically for obesity. The STEP program was a series of Novo Nordisk trials testing semaglutide at a higher dose, 2.4 milligrams weekly, specifically in people with obesity who did not have diabetes. Enrolling approximately 4,500 adults across multiple trials, the program measured outcomes after 68 weeks of treatment. Step 1 showed average weight loss of nearly 15% of body weight in the treatment group. Step 3 produced average reductions exceeding 17%. These figures were categorically different from what any previous FDA-approved weight loss medication had achieved. Older pharmaceutical interventions had typically produced average weight reductions of 5 to 10% at best, and most had come with side effect profiles that limited their use or led to their eventual withdrawal. Bariatric surgery had been producing 20 to 30% weight reduction in appropriate candidates, and that surgical range was what semaglutide at the higher dose was approaching pharmacologically. The FDA approved the 2.4 milligram formulation as Wegovy in June 2021 for chronic weight management. The boys in the special, when they eventually manufacture their own compound, are producing the same active ingredient these trials were testing. Cardiovascular outcomes added a dimension to semaglutide's clinical case that moved the drug beyond weight loss and into a different category of medical significance. The SELECT trial enrolled over 17,000 adults with established cardiovascular disease and obesity, but without diabetes, and tested whether semaglutide reduced the risk of major cardiovascular events compared to placebo. The result was a 20% reduction in those events in the treatment group. This was not a secondary finding or a statistical footnote. It was the primary endpoint of a large outcomes trial, and it meant semaglutide was protecting the hearts of people who were not taking it for their hearts. The drug that the special's insurance system refuses to cover for weight loss was, by the time the special aired, also a drug with documented protective effects in cardiovascular disease. The insurance exclusion and the cardiovascular benefit existed simultaneously. The system Cartman's doctor is describing was declining to cover a drug whose evidence base extended well beyond the calorie reduction story the coverage decision was treating it as. Off-label prescribing for weight loss in non-diabetic patients was the mechanism that created the shortage the episode operates inside. Ozempic had been approved for diabetes. Its weight loss effects were visible in clinical data and visible in patients who were losing significant weight on it. Physicians began prescribing it to patients without diabetes for the off-label purpose of weight management, which is legal in the United States. Doctors can prescribe approved drugs for unapproved uses, and patients can fill those prescriptions. By 2023, approximately a third of Ozempic prescriptions written were for off-label weight loss rather than diabetes. Social media accelerated the demand curve faster than any pharmaceutical marketing campaign could have. TikTok accounts documenting dramatic weight loss attributed to Ozempic accumulated millions of views. Celebrity bodies changed publicly, and the speculation was immediate. The supply chain that Novo Nordisk had built for a diabetic patient population of a predictable size was receiving demand from a much larger and faster-growing population. The shortage began. Diabetic patients who had been managing their blood sugar with Ozempic for years started finding it unavailable at their pharmacies. The National Association of Boards of Pharmacy flagged the shortage beginning in 2022. Some patients were switched to insulin, which carries hypoglycemia risks that Ozempic does not. Some were switched to older GLP-1 medications, requiring daily rather than weekly injections. The disruption condition was real, widespread, and had direct health consequences for the population the drug had been approved to treat. This is the background context of the special. When the show opens in the doctor's office, the shortage is already underway. The supply problem that will drive the boys to manufacture their own drug is not invented by the plot. It is inherited from conditions that existed in the real pharmaceutical market at the time of broadcast. Making semaglutide from scratch is, chemically speaking, not a trivial process at pharmaceutical grade. The active ingredient is a large peptide molecule, structurally complex, requiring precise synthesis to produce the specific amino acid sequence that gives it its biological activity, and needing sterile preparation and storage conditions to be safe for injection. What the boys are doing in the special, ordering raw active pharmaceutical ingredient from a supplier in India and mixing it with biostatic water locally, maps onto what the compound pharmacy market was doing in the real world during the shortage period. Licensed compounding pharmacies were purchasing bulk semaglutide active ingredient from overseas suppliers and preparing injectable formulations at prices dramatically below branded Wegovy. Quality control was the central concern the FDA raised, not whether the active ingredient was real, but whether the preparation was sterile, correctly concentrated, and free of unlisted additives. The episode's version of this, 4 kids mixing a drug in what is presumably a suburban kitchen, skips past those concerns. But the underlying economic logic, raw ingredient cheap, branded product expensive, gap large enough to motivate DIY production, is accurate. What Parker and Stone get right about semaglutide as a piece of satire is the thing that matters most, that the drug works, that the evidence is solid, and that the system's response to it is not primarily medical. The doctor in the episode does not question whether semaglutide would help Cartman. He recommends it. His clinical judgment is that Cartman should have it. The obstacle is not medical. The obstacle is administrative, a coverage decision made by an insurance company applying criteria designed for a different era of obesity medicine. Before the STEP data, before the SELECT data, before the FDA classified obesity itself as the chronic disease that semaglutide is now approved to treat. The show's satire lands because it accepts the drug's efficacy as a given, and then asks why that efficacy is not available to everyone for whom it is indicated. The doctor's office scene earns its jokes because the situation it depicts, a physician recommending a treatment and an insurance company declining to pay for it, is not a cartoon premise. It is a documented feature of American healthcare that was generating lawsuits, congressional proposals, and a compound pharmacy black market at the exact moment the special aired. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That is what semaglutide actually is, where it came from, and why the insurance problem the show depicts is not an exaggeration. Next, the episode itself, scene by scene, what Parker and Stone actually built across those 50 minutes, and why the choices they made are sharper than they first appear. Section 3. What the episode actually does. The end of obesity, scene by scene. Before the story begins, the show signals that something is different. The standard South Park disclaimer, the familiar card about all characters and events being fictional, is replaced with a new one. Viewers are told that during the episode, they will hear the actual sounds of Trey Parker injecting himself with a weight loss drug. This is confirmed as real. Parker, one of the show's 2 creators, had gone on semaglutide, and the special is beginning by acknowledging it. This is not a throwaway joke buried in the credits. It is placed up front before any story has started, and it collapses the distance between the satirist and the subject immediately. The show has spent 27 years building jokes about a fat cartoon character. Now the man who writes those jokes has injected himself with the drug the cartoon character cannot get. That context sits behind everything that follows. The episode proper opens in a doctor's office, with Cartman and his mother Leanne receiving the kind of news Cartman has been avoiding his entire life. The doctor tells them that Cartman's weight poses a real health risk and that something needs to change. What follows is the show's first direct engagement with semaglutide by name. The doctor runs through the GLP-1 medications available, Ozempic, Wegovy, and others, explaining what they do and why they work. Cartman's response to learning about the drugs is a fantasy sequence. He imagines himself thin, walking through the world with a slimmer body, and the fantasy is specifically about what he would do with the freedom from mockery that thinness would give him. He imagines insulting people without consequence, traveling to Pakistan to continue insulting people, living without the social penalty his weight currently attracts. The fantasy is not about health. It is not about energy or longevity or any of the things weight loss advertisements tend to reach for. It is purely about power, about the specific kind of social power Cartman has always wanted and believes his body is currently denying him. This This is a very precise piece of character work. The show is telling the audience exactly what Cartman thinks thinness is for. The doctor then delivers the episode's central complication. The insurance company will only cover semaglutide for patients with diabetes. Leanne does not have the money to pay out of pocket for the drug, and Cartman does not have diabetes. The door closes. As an alternative, the doctor prescribes Cartman a cheaper option, a medication that costs far less and has significant clinical support for making patients feel better about their weight. The medication is called Lizzo, named after the singer and body positivity advocate. The show delivers this as a fake prescription, and moments later as a fake commercial. The commercial, narrated with the deadpan voice of a real pharmaceutical advertisement, describes Lizzo as an FDA-approved drug that makes patients feel good about their weight and costs 90% less than Ozempic. Case studies show that a large percentage of patients on Lizzo no longer care how much they weigh. Side effects include lowered standards and reduced expectations. The joke is not simply at Lizzo's expense. The show is using her public persona as a stand-in for a specific argument, that body positivity, whatever its genuine value as a social movement, is being deployed by the medical and insurance system as a cheaper substitute for actual treatment. The drug does nothing to change the underlying condition. It changes how the patient feels about the condition, and that, from the insurance company's perspective, is sufficient. Cartman's contempt for his Lizzo prescription is where the episode lands one of its most quoted lines. Sitting with his diagnosis and his useless alternative, he states plainly that rich people get Ozempic and poor people get body positivity. This is the clearest the episode gets about its actual argument, and it arrives early, before any of the chaos that follows. The show is not interested in subtlety about what it is criticizing. The American healthcare system, as the episode frames it, does not fail people equally. It fails people in proportion to their income and their insurance status. The drug that works is available. The system simply declines to make it available to everyone. Kyle decides to solve the problem the way the show's protagonists often solve problems, by taking the matter into their own hands. When a labyrinthine trip through the insurance company's bureaucracy yields nothing, and the show spends a notable stretch of time with Butters lost in the system's waiting rooms and transfer loops, a sequence that plays as both comedy and documentary, the boys determine they will make the drug themselves. Research reveals that raw semaglutide powder can be purchased from a factory in India at a fraction of the cost of the finished pharmaceutical product, and that it can be mixed with biostatic water purchased locally. Kyle sets up production. The boys begin manufacturing their own semaglutide. The drug works. Cartman's appetite begins to come under control. The plan appears to be succeeding. Meanwhile, Randy Marsh is running a parallel story that begins as a broad comedy gag and develops into something the episode uses to show how the drug functions differently depending on who takes it and why. Randy notices that the mothers in his neighborhood have been taking semaglutide and have developed lean, toned bodies that they are showing off in crop tops. Randy initially positions himself as concerned by this, telling his daughter Sharon that exposed midriffs represent a social problem he intends to address. By the next scene, he has put on his daughter's crop top to embarrass her into dressing more conservatively, and the neighborhood mothers, seeing him wearing one, invite him to their semaglutide sharing parties. Randy begins taking the drug, not for health reasons, but because he discovers that it functions as a party drug that produces weight loss without the hangover that alcohol leaves behind. His relationship to the drug is entirely recreational. He is taking a medication designed for a specific clinical purpose because it suits his lifestyle. The show is not particularly subtle about what this is meant to represent. Sharon's subplot runs alongside Randy's and carries its own logic. Unable to afford Ozempic and ineligible under the diabetes coverage rule, she turns to the Lizzo prescription. A side effect develops in which she is defecating from her ears. The doctor identifies this condition with perfect, straight-faced South Park absurdist delivery as diabetes, a form of diabetes that specifically afflicts the ears. Because she now technically has diabetes, she qualifies for semaglutide coverage. The insurance company approves her prescription. She gets the drug she needed. She got there by developing a fictional ear diabetes as a consequence of the body positivity prescription the system handed her when it declined to treat her actual condition. The route to coverage runs through the Lizzo drug's side effects. The episode is making a point about how the insurance system forces patients to become sicker before it agrees to help them. The threat to Kyle's manufacturing operation arrives in the form of the episode's most visually inventive antagonists. A cartel representing the sugar industry shows up in the form of breakfast cereal mascots. Tony the Tiger, Captain Crunch, the Trix Rabbit, Sonny the Cuckoo Bird. These are recognizable corporate characters from the advertising aimed at American children for decades, and the show deploys them as hired killers. They have been watching the Ozempic situation with professional concern. The rise of GLP-1 drugs is cutting into their market. If Americans stop eating sugar-laden food, the industry that sells it loses money. The mascots pose as body positivity activists, which gives the show its most pointed and uncomfortable joke. When their attack on the Indian factory is reported in the news, the headline describes them as terrorists who claimed that obesity was not a disease and that everybody was beautiful, even as they burned the building and murdered the workers inside. The body positivity framing is being used as cover for an act of violence carried out in the interest of the sugar industry. The show is arguing, in its most grotesque register, that the forces most loudly celebrating large bodies are the same forces that profit most from people staying large. The government crackdown on semaglutide abuse provides the story's next complication. When authorities crack down on off-label and recreational use, targeting the suburban mothers who have been taking the drug at sharing parties, Randy and the mothers find themselves cut off from their supply. Their response escalates rapidly. They begin robbing pharmacies. When that supply runs out, they turn to robbing Kyle and the boys. Randy is fully participating in armed pharmaceutical robbery to maintain his access to a drug he was taking for lifestyle reasons. The show is drawing a line from recreational misuse to the supply disruption that actually happened, where off-label weight loss prescribing by non-diabetic patients created shortages for diabetic patients who depended on the medication. The show has shifted that consequence here, making it personal rather than systemic, giving it faces and actions rather than anonymous market forces. But the underlying mechanism is the same. Kyle locates another supply of semaglutide powder from a source in North Carolina and secures a truckload. The episode's third act becomes a high-speed chase involving the boys, the mothers, Randy, and the cereal mascots, all pursuing the same truck across what the show depicts with the visual energy of a desert action film. The cereal mascots are flying a Cocoa Puffs branded helicopter and firing from vehicles. The mothers are driving with the kind of single-minded aggression that the show has reserved throughout the episode for people who have been denied something they believe is theirs. Randy, somewhere in the middle of the chase, arrives at a realization that the mothers have gone too far and steals the truck from them to try to get it to Cartman. Kenny McCormick, in the tradition of his recurring fate across the show's history, is killed during the chase. Tony the Tiger throws him from the truck and into a car windshield. It is the first time Kenny has been killed in several years, and the show's decision to revive the joke here in an episode about what happens when corporate interests run over individuals is not incidental. Randy and the boys reach the end of the chase with the truck. They open it expecting to find the semaglutide. Inside, they find the insurance claims agent who has been processed through the episode's insurance bureaucracy subplot. The agent tells them that the insurance company works directly with the supplier. The supply that seems like a workaround to the system was never outside the system at all. The boys have gone through every step of the DIY manufacturing scheme, the Mad Max truck chase, the factory raid, the highway robbery, and the entire adventure, only to find the system waiting for them on the other side. The sugar cartel mascots are dead or gone. The mothers have lost their supply. The factory in India has been burned to the ground, and the insurance company still controls what is available and to whom. The show ends the episode's central conflict on a clear note. The protagonist lost and the institution won. The resolution splits into two separate endings that run in parallel. Randy stops Sharon from taking her first injection, confessing that he has been using semaglutide himself and that his desire for it came from the same place her desire came from. Her generous response to this confession: she is not angry, she understands, she is the kind of person who can hear that and respond with warmth, prompts Randy to announce that the drug is bad, that they should go to a Holiday Inn and take MDMA together the way they did in college. This is Randy's particular kind of moral clarity, a sentimental resolution that sidesteps the actual structural problem entirely. He loves his wife, so the drug question resolves itself. The systemic issue does not need to be addressed because the marriage is intact. Kyle's resolution is the one the episode gives real weight to. Standing in the school cafeteria, he delivers a speech renouncing everything the show has spent 27 years doing. He tells his classmates that he was wrong to think people with weight problems just needed more willpower. He has seen what it looks like when willpower is not the variable, when the sugar industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the insurance industry are all operating in coordination to shape what people eat, what treatments they can access, and how they feel about the result. He tells his classmates it is not fair to blame anyone for their weight given those forces. He asks for a pledge. The school agrees. No one will make fun of anyone's weight again. Cartman's response to this pledge is the episode's final joke and its thesis. Freed from the one weapon that has always been used against him in return for his own cruelties, he immediately begins insulting everyone in the room. Without the fat joke available as a comeback, his victims have nothing. He books a flight to Pakistan, as he imagined at the start of the episode, to insult people internationally without consequence. consequence. The system protected him too. Kyle's moral growth did not change Cartman. It gave him cover. The episode ends with the insurance company intact, the sugar industry largely unaddressed, the drug inaccessible to the people who need it most, and Cartman boarding a plane with his new freedom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was what the episode does across its 50 minutes, and the architecture of how it builds its argument. Next, the Lizzo joke specifically, what it is actually saying, how she reacted to it, and what the body positivity debate looks like when South Park steps into the middle of it. Section 4, the Lizzo joke, the reaction, and what the body positivity debate actually looks like. Naming a fake drug after Lizzo is a choice that requires unpacking before the reaction to it makes sense. The show does not simply drop her name as a throwaway insult. It constructs an entire pharmaceutical product around her public identity, complete with a fake television commercial voiced in the precise cadence of real drug advertising. The commercial describes Lizzo as FDA approved, states that it costs 90% less than Ozempic, and reports from case studies that 70% of patients on Lizzo no longer care how much they weigh. The list of side effects includes lowered standards and reduced expectations. The closing tagline asks patients to consult their doctor about the power of not giving a particular expletive with Lizzo. The format, calm voiceover, reassuring language, a side effect list delivered with bureaucratic neutrality, is lifted directly from the pharmaceutical advertising genre, and placing that format around body positivity messaging is the engine of the joke. The show is asking what it would look like if the thing being sold to people who cannot afford actual medical treatment was repackaged as medicine itself. The answer it gives is a commercial indistinguishable from a real drug ad, except that the active ingredient is self-acceptance, and the product does nothing to address the underlying condition. What that commercial script is actually doing, beneath the joke, is mounting an argument about substitution. The show is not saying that body positivity is worthless as a concept, or that Lizzo's advocacy is dishonest. It is saying that the insurance and healthcare system is using the language and imagery of body positivity as a cost-effective alternative to treatment. A drug that genuinely suppresses appetite and produces clinically significant weight loss is expensive and requires insurance coverage. A prescription to listen to music and watch videos costs almost nothing and requires no coverage decision at all. The doctor in the episode does not prescribe Lizzo because he believes it will help Cartman. He prescribes it because the system has closed every other door. The Lizzo prescription is what the system offers when the system has decided not to help. And the show is framing body positivity not as a companion to medical care, but as a replacement for it, offered specifically to people who cannot access the real thing. Alongside the commercial, the Sharon subplot extends this argument into something more structurally specific. Sharon cannot access Ozempic because the insurance company will only cover it for diabetic patients. She is prescribed Lizzo instead. The Lizzo prescription causes her to defecate from her ears. This side effect eventually results in a diagnosis of diabetes, which the show invents as an ear-specific form of diabetes. Because she now technically has a diabetes diagnosis, the insurance company approves her semaglutide coverage. She gets the drug she was always eligible for medically, but was denied administratively, and she gets it only after the cheaper substitute made her develop a new condition. The route to coverage runs through iatrogenic harm. The system required her to get sicker before it agreed to treat her, and the mechanism that made her sicker was the cheap alternative it prescribed her instead of helping her in the first place. The show is not being abstract here. It is describing, in cartoon form, a dynamic that exists in real American healthcare, where prior authorization requirements, step therapy protocols, and coverage exclusions routinely require patients to fail cheaper interventions before insurers will approve more effective ones. Delivered early in the episode and without ceremony, Cartman's summary of the situation lands as the cleanest line the special produces. Rich people get Ozempic, poor people get body positivity. This is the thesis the rest of the episode dramatizes rather than argues. The line is effective partly because it is accurate. Access to GLP-1 medications in 2024 was heavily correlated with income and insurance status. Patients with comprehensive coverage or the ability to pay out of pocket could access semaglutide with relative ease. Patients without those resources were navigating denial letters, appeal processes, and clinical justification requirements that most people did not have the time or medical literacy to navigate successfully. The gap was real, documented, and widely discussed in medical and policy circles. South Park did not invent the class dynamics of Ozempic access. It simply put them in Cartman's mouth and let the audience sit with them. Lizzo's actual response to being turned into a pharmaceutical product arrived on Instagram within 2 days of the special premiering. She posted a live reaction video watching the episode scene unfold unfold in real time, and her immediate verbal response was that her worst fear had been actualized. She had been referenced in a South Park episode. She described herself as scared, watching the fake commercial play out, and then pivoted into something that read as a mixture of genuine shock and self-possessed amusement. Her conclusion, stated directly to her followers, was that she was, in her own words, really that something. She followed this by pointing out that she had spent years showing the world how to love itself and not care what other people thought, to the point where 2 men in Colorado knew who she was well enough to put her on their 27-year-old cartoon. Her final assessment framed the reference as confirmation of her cultural impact, rather than as a wound. She said she would keep showing people how not to give a particular expletive. The response went viral. Most coverage described it as taking the joke in stride. What it was, more precisely, was a piece of brand management that matched the tone of her public persona so perfectly, it was almost indistinguishable from the show's satirical version of her. Born Melissa Vivian Jefferson in Detroit in 1988, Lizzo built her public identity around a combination of musical skill and deliberate self-presentation that pushed back against the narrow range of body types that had historically been celebrated in mainstream pop music. She plays the flute at a professional level and incorporates it into performances that mix hip-hop, R&B, and pop in ways that did not map onto any existing category cleanly when she first started gaining wider attention around 2019. Her Grammy wins and her commercial breakthrough with tracks that explicitly addressed self-worth, body confidence, and the refusal to apologize for existing in a larger body gave her a specific cultural identity. She became, for a substantial audience, the most visible mainstream figure associated with body positivity in contemporary music. The South Park writers knew exactly what they were doing when they named the fake drug after her. The joke only works because the connection between her public persona and the body positivity movement is so well established that it requires no explanation. Her identification with body positivity had also, by the time the special aired, begun to complicate itself in ways that the broader coverage of her reaction to the South Park reference largely skipped over. In a March 2024 interview with the New York Times, 2 months before the special premiered, Lizzo had spoken publicly about moving away from the strict body positivity framework toward what she described as body neutrality. She told the interviewer that she was not going to lie and claim she loved her body every single day because that was not honest, and that the way a person feels about their body changes constantly. This was a meaningful distinction. Body positivity, as a framework, asks people to actively love and celebrate their bodies. Body neutrality asks only that a person exist in their body without it being a source of either pride or shame. Lizzo's pivot toward neutrality suggested she had found the demands of body positivity, the constant performance of self-love, to be their own kind of burden. The South Park special aired in May and presented her as the pure embodiment of body positivity messaging. She had already, in her own words, begun to move past that position. The joke was slightly out of date before it landed. 3 months before the end of Obesity aired, a more significant piece of context had already attached itself to Lizzo's public image. In August 2023, 3 of her former backup dancers filed a lawsuit against her, alleging a hostile work environment, sexual harassment, and behavior that included weight shaming. Among the allegations was that one of the dancers had been questioned by a supervisor about her weight gain. Lizzo denied the allegations, and the lawsuit proceeded through the legal process. The show aired the special without addressing any of this in the episode itself. The Lizzo joke operates entirely on the basis of her body positivity public identity, not on the lawsuit. But the timing meant that cultural commentary around the special frequently referenced both. The gap between Lizzo's public advocacy for acceptance of all bodies and the private workplace behavior alleged in the suit was a point of discussion that the show's reference unintentionally stepped directly into. Whether that background made the joke sharper, crueler, or more complicated depended on which account of events one believed. Body positivity's actual origins sit far from the celebrity culture that now carries its name. The movement traces back to the late 1960s, when a small group of activists in New York began organizing against what they identified as systematic discrimination against fat people. Bill Fabry, an engineer whose wife faced repeated mistreatment because of her size, was one of the founders of what became the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, established in 1969. At the same time, feminist organizers in California were forming what they called the Fat Underground, a more radical wing that connected weight discrimination explicitly to patriarchy, racism, and capitalism. The original movement was built by and for people in genuinely marginalized bodies, particularly fat, black, queer, and disabled bodies, and its concerns were specifically about legal rights, employment discrimination, discrimination, and access to medical care. Fat people were being refused employment, denied insurance coverage, and receiving inadequate medical treatment because of their weight. The movement existed to challenge those conditions. It was not primarily about self-esteem. It was about structural discrimination. What happened to that original movement over the following 50 years involved a gradual process of expansion and dilution that its founders and early participants frequently criticized. As the framework reached mainstream audiences, particularly through social media in the early 2000s, the political specificity of the original fat rights arguments gave way to something much broader and, critics argued, much emptier. Instagram hashtags like body positive and F your beauty standards accumulated millions of posts, the majority of which featured not the marginalized bodies the movement had been created to advocate for, but conventionally attractive, thin adjacent white women posting about self-acceptance on low-confidence days. The research confirmed this. Studies found that the overwhelming majority of body positivity content on Instagram featured young, white, non-disabled cisgender women. The people the movement had been built to protect, fat, black, disabled, queer bodies, were no more visible in the body positivity content than they had been before the movement went mainstream. The mainstream had absorbed the language without carrying the people. Corporate brands moved in once body positivity became a legible marketing category. Fashion companies began running campaigns celebrating diverse bodies, while selling clothes that did not extend to the largest sizes. Food companies adopted body-positive messaging while continuing to engineer their products to maximize consumption. The advertising industry recognized that telling consumers to love themselves exactly as they were was compatible with selling them anything, because self-acceptance does not require changing one's purchasing behavior. Body positivity became, in the hands of marketing departments, a tool for building brand loyalty in demographics that had historically felt excluded from aspirational advertising. The radical argument that structural forces were responsible for fat discrimination, that employment law, medical practice, and insurance policy needed to change, had been replaced by a message about feeling good about yourself, which required no change in any system at all. The South Park special was not inventing a critique when it suggested that body positivity functions as a cheaper substitute for medical care. That critique had been made by fat rights activists, academic researchers, and medical ethicists for years before Parker and Stone got to it. South Park's specific argument is not that body positivity causes harm by existing. Kyle's speech at the end of the episode makes that clear. He does not recant his advocacy against fat shaming. He explicitly endorses it. What the show argues through the Lizzo drug is that the system has picked up the language of body positivity and is using it instrumentally as a cost-saving measure that deflects attention from a treatment gap it has no intention of closing. The sugar cartel mascots pose as body positivity activists while burning a factory. The insurance company hands out Lizzo prescriptions while declining to cover the medication that would actually help. The show is pointing at a specific mechanism, the way in which movements built to protect marginalized people can be co-opted by the institutions those movements were built against, and turned into a tool that serves institutional interests while wearing the language of liberation. Doctors and medical researchers who commented on the special after it aired noted that the episode's portrayal of insurance denial mechanics was realistic to a degree that surprised many viewers expecting pure cartoon exaggeration. A physician researcher specializing in obesity named Yoni Friedhoff praised the episode's accuracy in depicting how insurance systems create barriers to GLP-1 access and how body positivity advocacy had been positioned in opposition to medical treatment of obesity. The real medical debate at the time was not significantly different from the one the episode dramatized. One side argued that obesity should be treated as the chronic disease the medical evidence supported it being, with appropriate pharmacological intervention and insurance coverage. The other side argued, for a variety of reasons ranging from genuine concern about medicalization to financial interest in maintaining the status quo, that acceptance and lifestyle modification were sufficient responses. Between those two positions were millions of people who wanted access to a drug their doctors had recommended, whose insurance companies had declined to pay for it, and who had been handed some version of the Lizzo prescription instead. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up is the cereal mascots, who they represent, what the sugar industry has actually done, and why turning Tony the Tiger into an armed cartel killer is more accurate as satire than it might first appear. Section 5. Tony the Tiger has a gun, Big Sugar, the mascots, and what the satire is actually hitting. Tony the Tiger makes his entrance approximately halfway through the special, and the show commits to the bit completely. Captain Crunch is there, the Trix Rabbit, Sonny the Cuckoo Bird from Cocoa Puffs. These are characters that have existed in American advertising for decades, designed specifically to sell sugar-laden food to children, and South Park has given them automatic weapons and a business motive. They arrive at the Indian factory where Kyle's semaglutide operation is running, kill the workers, and burn the building to the ground. The news report that covers the attack frames them as body positivity activists. The headline, delivered with the same flat journalistic tone the show uses for all its news graphics, states that the terrorists claimed obesity was not a disease and that every body was beautiful as they burned the factory to the ground. The joke is not that cereal mascots are funny with guns, though they are. The joke is that the cover story they use is indistinguishable from the language of a genuine social movement, and that the media reported it without apparent skepticism. The show is describing a mechanism, not just a sight gag. Choosing those specific mascots was precise work. Tony the Tiger, created in 1952 for Frosted Flakes, Captain Crunch, launched in 1963, the Trix Rabbit, introduced in 1959, and Sonny the Cuckoo Bird, who first appeared in Cocoa Puffs advertising in 1963. These are all characters whose entire existence is the marketing of high-sugar breakfast products to children. They are not adult advertising. They are child-facing corporate mascots designed by research-backed marketing departments to create brand loyalty in the youngest possible consumer, before a child has any framework for evaluating what is being sold to them. The show is not using them because animated mascots are funny opponents for animated children. It is using them because these specific characters are the public face of an industry that spent decades making high-sugar food the default start to an American child's day. And those same children grew up to be adults whose relationship with sugar was shaped in part by what those mascots were selling them at age 4. Parker and Stone picked the villains deliberately. The villain is not a generic food company. The villain is the childhood itself, or at least the corporate version of it. Breakfast cereal advertising aimed at children has a history as a marketing category that predates television. The category grew dramatically through the 1950s and 1960s as television penetration in American homes expanded and advertising to children became a viable mass market strategy. By the 1970s, Saturday morning cartoons were essentially delivery systems for cereal advertising, with mascot-fronted commercials running in rotation alongside programming that itself frequently featured the same characters. The sugar content of the cereals being marketed during this period was extraordinary by any standard. Some products were more than 50% sugar by weight. Children were consuming products that were closer to candy than to nutritional food, and the marketing framing consistently positioned these products as part of a healthy morning routine. The characters doing the selling were friendly, exciting, and designed to generate emotional attachment in children who were not yet capable of critically evaluating advertising claims. The strategy worked for decades with minimal regulatory interference. Documented evidence of the food and sugar industry's influence on American dietary policy goes significantly further than advertising. A paper published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2016 revealed that the Sugar Research Foundation, the lobbying arm of the sugar industry, had in the late 1960s funded research specifically designed to shift scientific and public attention away from sugar as a driver of heart disease and toward dietary fat instead. The researchers whose work was funded published their findings in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967 without disclosing the industry funding source, and their conclusions steered decades of dietary guidance toward low-fat recommendations while downplaying the role of sugar. The researchers identified by the 2016 paper had died by the time it was published, so direct accountability was not possible. What was possible was tracing the downstream effects of those conclusions on American dietary policy. The low-fat dietary guidelines that dominated official recommendations from the late 1970s onward had the practical effect of increasing sugar consumption because food manufacturers replaced fat with sugar to maintain palatability in products reformulated to meet low-fat labeling requirements. People who were trying to eat healthily by following official guidance were consuming more sugar than they had before because the guidance had been shaped by an industry with a financial interest in that outcome. High fructose corn syrup arrived in the American food supply at scale beginning in the mid-1970s, after the development of an industrial enzyme process that made it cheaper to produce than cane sugar. By 1984, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi had switched their American formulas from cane sugar to high fructose corn syrup. By 1999, the average American was consuming roughly 60 pounds of high fructose corn syrup per year. The obesity epidemic, in the assessment of multiple researchers, appeared in American health data beginning around 1976 to 1980. The timing was not coincidental. Ultra-processed foods made with cheap caloric sweeteners sweeteners, engineered for palatability, priced below whole foods, and marketed aggressively were entering the food supply in unprecedented volume at exactly the moment that American obesity rates began their long upward trajectory. The food industry understood this connection. A review of internal documents cited in academic literature found that by 1999, food industry executives had access to internal research confirming their product's contribution to the obesity epidemic and had failed to act on it. The pattern had precedent. It resembled closely what tobacco industry documents would later reveal about nicotine and addiction, an industry aware of the harm its products caused, choosing profit over disclosure. Food scientists working for major consumer goods companies had by the early 1980s developed sophisticated methods for engineering products that maximized consumption. Former FDA Commissioner David Kessler documented this in detail in his 2009 book on the subject, describing how companies invested substantial research resources into finding what he termed the bliss point of any given product, the precise combination of sugar, fat, and salt at which the product generated the strongest possible compulsion to keep eating. Products engineered to hit this point generated consumption that went beyond hunger. People eating them were not responding to the biological signal that they needed calories. They were responding to a stimulus that had been calibrated in a laboratory to override the satiety signals that would normally tell them to stop. The food was, in a specific and technical sense, designed to make people eat more of it than they intended to. This was not a side effect. It was the goal. Food companies competed on palatability, and palatability was measured in consumption. The more a product was eaten, the more successful it was, and the science of engineering products for maximum consumption was among the most well-funded and carefully guarded intellectual property in the industry. Quantifying the economic threat that GLP-1 drugs represent to companies built on that model clarifies why animated cereal mascots with automatic weapons make sense as a satirical vehicle. A 2024 Cornell University study found that households with at least one GLP-1 user cut grocery spending by an average of more than 5% within 6 months of starting the medication. Spending at fast food restaurants and coffee shops fell by approximately 8%. Spending on savory snacks dropped by around 10%. Purchases of sweets, baked goods, and cookies declined by similar margins. Research firm Numerator found that GLP-1 users reduced spending by approximately 10% across 100 consumer categories within a year. When households stopped taking the medication, their spending returned to pre-adoption levels, confirming that the behavioral change was driven by the drug rather than by any independent shift in preferences. People on semaglutide were eating less sugar. They were buying less cereal. They were visiting fast food restaurants less often. The companies that had spent decades engineering products to maximize consumption were watching their market contract in direct proportion to GLP-1 adoption rates. Major food companies were tracking this carefully, and some were responding with alarm. Walmart's chief executive had mentioned publicly in 2023 that GLP-1 users in the retailer's customer base were buying meaningfully less food overall. This was not a rounding error in the data. It was a trend with structural implications for any company whose revenue depended on how much Americans ate. Novo Nordisk's CEO Lars Fruergaard Jorgensen confirmed in a 2024 interview that food companies had been calling him to express concern about what GLP-1 drugs were doing to their business. The manufacturer of the drug was receiving anxious phone calls from the industry that had most benefited from the conditions the drug was designed to address. This is the dynamic South Park was depicting when it showed cereal mascots arriving at a semaglutide manufacturing facility with weapons. The specificity of who the mascots are matters. They are not generic food company representatives. They are the childhood-facing, trust-building, sugar-selling characters whose entire purpose has been to create a relationship between American children and sugary food that begins before those children can read and persists into adulthood as brand loyalty and habituated consumption. Parker and Stone made the most pointed creative choice of the special when they decided that the mascots would pose as body positivity activists while committing their attack. This is the move that elevates the cereal mascot subplot from a funny action sequence into something the show is actually arguing. The sugar industry has, in the real world, not sent armed cartoon characters to burn down pharmaceutical facilities, but it has funded research that downplayed the health consequences of sugar consumption. It has lobbied against dietary guidelines that would have reduced sugar in the food supply. It has used marketing aimed at children to build consumption habits before children could evaluate what they were consuming. And the language of acceptance, of not stigmatizing any body or any food choice, has at various points been available as a rhetorical tool for resisting health interventions that would have reduced consumption of profitable profitable products. The show is not claiming a direct line between body positivity advocates and the sugar industry. It is pointing at the way in which the two things can produce the same outcome: resistance to treating obesity medically, and asking the audience to consider who benefits from that outcome. Burning down a factory while claiming to be activists protecting body image is the show's most compressed statement of a real phenomenon. Industries that profit from conditions they helped create, deploying the language of social justice to resist interventions that would address those conditions. The tobacco industry funded research promoting smoking as a relaxation tool and a tool for weight management. The opioid industry marketed its products through physicians it paid to describe addiction risk as minimal. The sugar and ultra-processed food industry funded nutrition research that served its interests while training generations of consumers to associate its products with morning routines, celebration, and childhood. Each of these industries, when pressed, has been capable of using the language of consumer choice, individual freedom, and stigma reduction to resist regulatory or medical intervention. South Park compressed that history into Tony the Tiger pulling the pin on a grenade and the news calling him a body positivity activist, and the compression does not distort the underlying shape of what actually happened. Kenny McCormick's death in the truck chase is handled with the specific ceremony the show has developed over years for this recurring event. Tony the Tiger throws him from the moving vehicle. Kenny hits a car windshield. He dies. The show had not killed Kenny in several years before this special, and the choice to revive the joke here is worth noting. Kenny has historically died as a consequence of forces and systems beyond his control, often in ways that the other characters acknowledge briefly before moving on. Putting his death at Tony the Tiger's hands in a chase that began because a drug company's supply was being fought over by mothers in withdrawal, a sugar cartel, and a group of children trying to get medication their friend needed, is the show placing Kenny in his traditional structural role. He is the casualty of a system that does not notice his absence. Nobody is held accountable for what Tony the Tiger did. The cereal mascots are eventually killed or dispersed in the chase. The sugar industry, as an institution, is not addressed at the episode's end. That is the part of the special's ending that the mascot subplot is responsible for establishing. The cereal mascots die. The visible agents of the sugar cartel are destroyed in the chase and its aftermath. But the underlying system that produced them, that funded the research, shaped the guidelines, engineered the food, and built the consumption habits of several American generations, is entirely intact when the episode concludes. Kyle's speech in the cafeteria is aimed at personal behavior and interpersonal respect. It asks his classmates not to blame individuals for their weight. It says nothing about the industry that shaped those individuals' relationship with food from the age at which they were old enough to recognize a cartoon tiger on a cereal box. The show blows up the mascots and leaves the factory standing. The villains with faces are removed. The structural villain remains. This is how South Park tends to work. The episode identifies who built the system, dramatizes the consequences in cartoon form, and then returns everything to status quo, because the status quo is the point. The system does not get fixed, it gets depicted. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was Big Sugar, the mascots, and how the show used childhood advertising icons to make an argument about an industry. Next, the American healthcare system's role in the special, the insurance bureaucracy scenes, how accurate they actually are, and what the downer ending is really saying. Section 6. The insurance company always wins. Healthcare, bureaucracy, and the downer ending. Butter Stotch gets lost in the American healthcare system, and the show gives him a musical number to mark the occasion. After Cartman's insurance denial, Kyle takes the lead in trying to navigate the official channels. He brings Butters to the insurance company's office to file a claim, and what follows is the special's most sustained piece of structural comedy. The insurance office exists in a separate dimensional space from the rest of the episode. Corridors lead to other corridors. Representatives redirect to other representatives. Every path through the building loops back to a waiting room that looks identical to the one they just left. Butters, following the directions he has been given, ends up moving through the system for what appears to be an indefinite period. He is not stopped, he is not rejected outright, he is simply processed through a structure that has no exit in the direction he is trying to travel. The show is depicting, with cartoon precision, the specific experience of trying to obtain coverage for a medication through a system that has been designed to absorb the effort of the attempt without ever producing the outcome the patient is looking for. The bureaucracy sequence is not invented. Prior authorization, the process by which an insurance company requires a physician to obtain approval before a covered medication is dispensed, exists across most American commercial insurance plans, and is one of the most consistently criticized features of the current system. The American Medical Association has has published surveys finding that physicians spend an average of nearly 14 hours per week, more than a full working day, completing prior authorization paperwork and follow-up on behalf of patients. 88% of physicians surveyed described the burden as high or extremely high. 33% said they had staff members who worked exclusively on prior authorization tasks. The process requires physicians to document clinical necessity, submit forms, respond to information requests, and frequently resubmit when initial requests are denied on technical grounds. Patients waiting for approval during this period may be without medication for days or weeks. For medications like semaglutide, where the insurance company's coverage criteria require a specific diagnosis that many patients seeking weight management do not have, the process frequently ends in denial regardless of how many times it is resubmitted. Insurance companies have specific reasons articulated in their coverage policies for denying GLP-1 medications to patients seeking them for weight loss rather than diabetes management. The most common documented reason is classification. Obesity treatments have historically been categorized by many insurers as elective or cosmetic rather than medically necessary, a classification that places them in the same coverage tier as procedures like cosmetic surgery. This classification persists even after the FDA approved both Wegovy in 2021 and Zepbound in 2023 specifically for obesity treatment, and even after the American Medical Association has classified obesity as a chronic disease since 2013. The reclassification of obesity by the medical community has not automatically translated into reclassification of obesity treatment by the insurance industry. Insurers cite cost as the underlying reason, and they are not wrong that the cost is real. A monthly supply of Wegovy at list price runs approximately $1,300. Extended to a year, that is over $15,000 per patient. Scaled to the roughly 100 million American adults who meet clinical criteria for GLP-1 eligibility, the number becomes one that insurance actuaries treat as a coverage liability rather than a health investment. Step therapy requirements represent a second barrier that operates differently from the blanket coverage denial. Step therapy, sometimes called fail-first protocols, requires patients to try less expensive treatments before an insurer will consider approving a more expensive one. For obesity, this typically means demonstrating documented failure of medically supervised diet and exercise programs before a GLP-1 medication will be considered. The requirement seems logical in the abstract. Try cheaper options first, escalate to expensive ones when simpler approaches fail, but in practice, it introduces delays measured in months for patients seeking access to medication that clinical evidence supports as the most effective intervention available. It also places the burden of documenting failure on the patient and physician, creating administrative work that falls disproportionately on patients who have fewer resources to manage it. The process of failing enough other interventions to qualify for the drug can itself take long enough that health consequences accumulate in the interim. The legal challenges to these coverage decisions were already multiplying when the South Park special aired. A case filed in federal court in Maine, Whittemore versus Cigna Health and Life Insurance Company, alleged that Cigna had engaged in disability discrimination under the Affordable Care Act by excluding semaglutide drugs from coverage when prescribed for obesity, while covering those same drugs when prescribed for diabetes. The plaintiff argued that because Cigna's own internal policies acknowledge semaglutide as medically necessary to treat obesity, denying coverage for that indication while allowing it for another constituted discrimination against people with obesity as a health condition. The case articulated a legal argument that was becoming increasingly common in policy discussions, that blanket exclusions of obesity treatments from insurance coverage were not neutral cost containment measures, but discriminatory practices that disadvantage people with a recognized chronic disease. Whether courts would accept that argument was unresolved at the time of the special's release, and it remained unresolved for some time afterward. Medicare's exclusion of weight loss drugs from Part D prescription coverage had been federal policy for decades before the GLP-1 era, dating back to the Medicare Modernization Act of 2003, which explicitly prohibited Part D plans from covering drugs used for weight loss. This exclusion was not revisited when the FDA approved Wegovy for obesity in 2021, or when the SELECT trial data demonstrated cardiovascular benefits that place semaglutide clearly within the scope of conditions Medicare routinely covered. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 began allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices for other medications, but the weight loss exclusion remained a separate legislative matter requiring its own fix. Proposals to allow Medicare coverage of GLP-1 drugs for obesity were introduced in Congress and attracted bipartisan support because the demographics of obesity in America are not neatly partisan, but legislative momentum moves slowly relative to patient need. And through the period when the South Park special aired, Medicare beneficiaries seeking semaglutide for weight management were largely paying out of pocket or going without. The gap between what the drug costs at list price and what most people can afford to pay out of pocket created the compound pharmacy market that the episode depicts. When Kyle's friends start manufacturing semaglutide themselves, the boys discover that raw semaglutide powder can be purchased from a supplier in India and mixed locally with biostatic water, producing a version of the medication at a fraction of the branded cost. This is a compressed but structurally accurate depiction of what the compound pharmacy market was actually doing. Licensed compounding pharmacies in the United States were purchasing active pharmaceutical ingredient semaglutide from bulk suppliers and mixing it into injectable solutions that could be dispensed at prices ranging from roughly $100 to $400 per month, compared to the $1,300 list price for brand name Wegovy. The FDA's concerns about these products were real and documented. Quality control inspections found facilities with sterility problems, dosing concentration errors, and unlisted additives. Patients self-adjusting their doses based on social media guidance were sometimes using amounts outside the range studied in clinical trials. The compound pharmacy market existed because the official market was inaccessible, and the risks it carried were a direct consequence of the access gap. Kyle and his friends are not doing something irrational when they decide to make the drug themselves. They are doing what the system's structure has made rational. What the episode does with the insurance claims agent at the end of the truck chase is one of the most specific images in the special. After the entire adventure, the factory in India, the North Carolina supplier, the highway chase involving armed cereal mascots, and a helicopter, Randy and the boys open the truck expecting to find semaglutide. Inside, they find the insurance claims agent who has been bouncing through the bureaucracy subplot. He tells them that the insurance company has a working relationship with the supplier. The workaround was never outside the system. The truck the boys spent the third act fighting over was connected to the same institution that denied Cartman's coverage in the first scene. The show is not arguing that the specific details of this would be true in any real supply chain. It is arguing something about the structural relationship between insurance companies, pharmaceutical supply, and access. The institution is not simply an obstacle that can be circumvented if the patient is clever enough or determined enough. It is embedded in the supply chain itself. Going around it leads back to it. The downer ending that follows from this discovery deserves examination as a piece of craft rather than just a conclusion. South Park has a long history of episodes that do not resolve their central conflicts in ways that comfort the audience. The show's most pointed satire has frequently ended with the system intact and the protagonists unchanged or worse off. What makes the end of Obesity ending distinctive is how specifically it allocates what was lost and what survived. The cereal mascots are dead. The body positivity cover story has been exposed, at least to the audience. Randy has had a personal epiphany about his wife. Kyle has delivered a speech about compassion that his classmates agreed to honor. These are the episode's consolations, and they are real as far as they go. But Cartman never got the drug. The Indian factory was burned. The North Carolina supply was inside a truck controlled by the insurance company. The boys have no remaining options. The insurance system, which denied Cartman's coverage in the first scene, has lost nothing. It has, if anything, strengthened its position. The alternative supply chain the boys built was destroyed. The compound pharmacy workaround was neutralized. The institution that failed them at the start is the institution they are left with at the end. Kyle's speech is the emotional peak of the episode, and the show frames it as a genuine moral development. He tells his classmates that he was wrong about willpower. He describes the sugar companies, the pharmaceutical companies, and the insurance companies as forces operating in coordination against the individual, making willpower an inadequate response to a structural problem. He is correct about this, and the show is endorsing his analysis. But the speech is aimed entirely at interpersonal behavior. It asks students not to make fun of each other's weight. It does not address the insurance exclusion. It does not demand pharmaceutical pricing reform. It does not propose any change to the system that created the conditions Kyle has just diagnosed. The speech is emotionally satisfying and politically inert. The show is making a point about the limits of consciousness raising as a response to structural problems. Kyle understands what is wrong. He changes how he talks about it. Nothing else changes. Cartman's immediate exploitation of the no fat shaming pledge is the punchline and the thesis simultaneously. The system failed him, but the pledge gives him something. He cannot get the drug. He cannot change his body through the medical intervention that the episode has established is the appropriate treatment for his condition. What he can get is protection from the one form of retaliation his his cruelty has historically attracted. The social contract Kyle has established removes the only consequence Cartman has ever faced for being unpleasant to everyone around him. He boards a plane to Pakistan to continue insulting people internationally without fear of the fat-ass comeback that would have neutralized him before. His weight has become, in the episode's final image, not a medical problem that was addressed, but a social status that was renegotiated. He is still fat. He still does not have the drug. He has simply removed one consequence of being fat without addressing any of the conditions that made the consequence feel urgent in the first place. South Park has depicted unwinnable structural situations before with similar architecture. The show's most consistent formal argument across its long run has been that systems persist regardless of individual moral growth, that institutions outlast the people who try to fix them, and that satire itself, the thing the show is doing, does not constitute a solution. Parker and Stone have operated for years from a position that their job is to describe clearly, not to prescribe correctively. The End of Obesity is the fullest expression of that position the show has produced on a healthcare subject. It identifies every relevant actor: the insurance company, the pharmaceutical company, the sugar industry, the body positivity movement as deployed by those interests, the compound pharmacy market as an imperfect workaround, and the media that reported on all of it. It gives them all roles in a 50-minute story that ends with the institution standing and the patient without his medication. The description is accurate. The prescription is absent. The audience is left with a clear picture of something it cannot fix by watching a cartoon. Medical professionals commenting on the episode after its release were notably specific about its accuracy. Obesity medicine specialists identified the insurance denial mechanics, the step therapy dynamics, and the compound pharmacy subplot as realistic depictions of conditions their patients navigated regularly. One physician researcher described the episode as more documentary than parody, which is a particular kind of compliment for a show that has always insisted it is just making jokes. The joke and the documentary occupy the same space in the End of Obesity, and neither one cancels the other out. The bureaucracy is funny. The bureaucracy is real. The bureaucracy wins. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was the insurance system, how the episode depicts it, and what the downer ending is actually arguing. Next, the compound pharmacy subplot in more depth. The real market that Kyle's operation mirrors. How it grew, what the FDA eventually did about it, and what it revealed about who gets to decide what medicine is available and to whom. Section 7. Kyle's Lab. The compound pharmacy market, the FDA crackdown, and who controls medicine. Kyle's plan in the special is not far-fetched. When the official healthcare system closes every door, he researches what is actually inside the medication he is trying to access, and finds that the raw active ingredient semaglutide powder can be purchased directly from a manufacturing facility in India at a price that bears no relationship to what a pharmacy charges for the finished product. He buys it. He mixes it with biostatic water purchased locally. He produces a working version of the drug for a fraction of the branded cost, and he starts distributing it to people in South Park who need it. The episode plays this as a scrappy workaround by resourceful children, which it is within the fiction. Outside the fiction, the same basic logic, raw pharmaceutical ingredients sourced internationally, mixed at low cost, distributed at a price far below the branded product, was the foundation of an entire industry that had grown to massive scale in the United States in the 2 years before the special aired. Kyle was not inventing a scheme. He was depicting one that already existed and was already being used by millions of people. Compounding pharmacies have been part of American pharmaceutical practice for as long as pharmacies have existed. The original pharmacist was a compounder, mixing medications from raw ingredients to meet specific patient needs before pharmaceutical manufacturing existed at scale. Federal law accommodates compounding in two specific contexts: when a patient has an allergy to an ingredient in a commercially available product, or when a commercially available drug is on the FDA's official shortage list. The shortage provision is the one that opened the GLP-1 market. Under sections 503A and 503B of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, state-licensed pharmacies and larger outsourcing facilities can legally compound copies of drugs that are in documented shortage, dispensing them to patients who cannot access the commercial version. The shortage provision exists because the alternative, leaving patients without medication while manufacturers catch up with demand, was judged to be the greater harm. The provision was created for legitimate supply chain disruptions. What happened with semaglutide tested the provision against a disruption of a scale nobody had designed it for. The National Association of Boards of Pharmacy began flagging semaglutide supply issues in 2022. By early 2023, the shortage was visible in pharmacy chains across the United States. Diabetic patients who had been stable on Ozempic Ozempic for years were arriving at pharmacies and being told the medication was unavailable. Some were switched to insulin, which carries a higher risk of hypoglycemic episodes for patients who had not previously been managing their blood sugar that way. Others were switched to older GLP-1 medications that required daily rather than weekly injections and produce less consistent results. The shortage was not a manufacturing defect. Novo Nordisk was producing semaglutide. The supply chain had simply not been built for a demand curve that increased by orders of magnitude in less than 2 years, driven by off-label prescribing for weight loss that the company had not projected and could not immediately match. Building new pharmaceutical-grade manufacturing capacity is a process that takes years and hundreds of millions of dollars in capital investment. Novo Nordisk announced manufacturing expansion plans repeatedly through this period, but the gap between announcement and increased supply was measured in years. Compounding pharmacies moved into that gap with speed that the regulatory framework had not anticipated. Once semaglutide appeared on the FDA's drug shortage list, the legal basis for compounding it was established, and hundreds of 503A state-licensed pharmacies and 503B outsourcing facilities began offering compounded injectable semaglutide to patients who could not access the branded product. Telehealth companies built entire business models around the combination of an online physician consultation and a mailed compounded semaglutide injection. The pricing differential was significant enough to create substantial demand independent of any shortage-related necessity. A monthly supply of Wegovy at its list price was approximately $1,300. Compounded semaglutide from telehealth providers was available for as little as $100 to $200 per month. The access gap this price difference created extended well beyond the patients who were being turned away from pharmacies due to shortage. It included anyone who could not get insurance coverage for the medication and could not afford the list price, which was the majority of people who wanted the drug. Quality control was where the compound pharmacy market created genuine patient risk. The FDA's role in approving a pharmaceutical product includes not just evaluating whether the active ingredient is effective, but verifying that the manufacturing process reliably produces consistent, sterile, accurately dosed medication at commercial scale. Compounded products bypass this review process. They are prepared by individual pharmacies rather than by centralized manufacturers operating under the FDA's Good Manufacturing Practice standards. And the quality of a compounded product depends on the specific practices of the specific facility that prepared it. When FDA inspectors examined compounding facilities operating in the semaglutide market, they found problems. One major inspection, conducted at a facility acquired by the telehealth company Hims & Hers in September 2024, identified troubling quality control failures, including sterility concerns and process irregularities. Other inspections across the compound pharmacy sector found dosing concentration errors, meaning patients were receiving more or less of the active ingredient than the label stated, and unlisted additives including various forms of vitamin B12 and other compounds that had not been part of any clinical trial for semaglutide. Reports of adverse events connected to compounded products accumulated in the FDA's Adverse Event Reporting System through 2024. Many involved dosing errors that produced more severe gastrointestinal side effects than patients expected. Some involved hospitalizations. Hims & Hers was among the most prominent companies in the compounded GLP-1 market, and its trajectory through the regulatory period illustrates how the industry navigated between access, opportunity, and legal exposure. The company had begun offering compounded injectable semaglutide in early 2024 and expanded into a compounded oral semaglutide tablet later that year. The oral formulation was particularly legally complex because no FDA-approved oral semaglutide product existed at obesity-level dosing at the time, which meant the product could not straightforwardly claim to be filling a shortage gap for an equivalent approved drug. The FDA sent a warning letter directly to the company's CEO in September 2025, citing claims on the company's marketing that the compounded product contained the same active ingredient as Ozempic and Wegovy and had been clinically proven, both of which the FDA characterized as false and misleading. Compounded drugs, by regulatory definition, are not FDA-approved products and cannot claim equivalence to approved drugs. The warning letter specified that these claims needed to be removed and that the practices producing them needed to stop. Novo Nordisk pursued the compound pharmacy market through civil litigation alongside the regulatory process. The company sent cease and desist letters to compounding pharmacies and physician offices directing them to stop producing and prescribing compounded semaglutide. It filed lawsuits against multiple compounders, framing the compounded products as essentially copies of its branded medications produced without authorization and without the quality controls that the approval process required. The company's position was straightforward from a brand protection standpoint. Patients taking a compounded semaglutide product that caused an adverse event might attribute that event to semaglutide as a class rather than to the specific compounded product, potentially damaging the reputation of the branded version. Additionally, every patient who accessed compounded semaglutide at $150 per month was a patient who was not paying $1,300 per month for Wegovy. The financial stakes were large enough that litigation was a rational response to the scale of the compounding market, independent of the quality control argument. The FDA's formal declaration that the semaglutide shortage had been resolved came on February 21, 2025. This declaration had immediate legal consequences. The shortage provision of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that had created the legal basis for compounding semaglutide ceased to apply once the FDA determined that sufficient commercial supply existed to meet demand. The agency set enforcement deadlines for compounders to wind down their operations, with state-licensed 503A pharmacies required to stop compounding semaglutide immediately following the declaration, and 503B outsourcing facilities given until May 22, 2025 to phase out production. The Outsourcing Facilities Association, an industry group representing larger compounding operations, filed federal lawsuits in both Texas district courts challenging the shortage determination and the enforcement deadlines. The courts denied preliminary injunctions in both cases, allowing the FDA's enforcement timeline to proceed. The legal pathway for mass compounding of semaglutide closed. What followed the official closure of the compounding market was not a clean transition. The pharmaceutical market that had grown up around compounded semaglutide was worth billions of dollars and had enrolled millions of patients who were now without affordable access to a medication they had been taking. Some patients who stopped taking semaglutide when compounded versions became unavailable experienced the weight regain that clinical data had consistently documented. The Step 1 extension trial had shown that participants regained approximately 2/3 of their lost weight within a year of stopping semaglutide. Patients who had been on compounded versions for months and then lost access were experiencing that rebound against a background of pharmaceutical market restructuring, with Novo Nordisk and telehealth partners like Ro and Hims working out new arrangements and FDA enforcement continuing. The transition period was not smooth. In March 2026, the FDA issued 30 warning letters to telehealth companies in a single day for making false or misleading claims about compounded GLP-1 products. The agency's commissioner described it as a new era in enforcement. South Park's version of this market, compressed into Kyle's India-sourced semaglutide powder and biostatic water operation, captures the essential logic without the regulatory specificity. The boys are doing what compound pharmacies did, identifying that the gap between the cost of the active ingredient and the cost of the branded product is large enough to make DIY production economically rational, and filling that gap with their own supply chain. The episode does not distinguish between the legal and illegal versions of this, which is consistent with the show's general approach. The distinction between licensed 503A compounding and unlicensed copying, which the FDA spends considerable regulatory energy maintaining, is not something that appears in South Park's version of the story. What appears is the underlying dynamic: a drug that works, a price that is prohibitive, a manufacturing process that is not actually that complicated once the raw ingredient is sourced, and a population of people who need it badly enough to source the raw ingredient. The discovery that the insurance claims agent is inside the truck is the episode's most pointed observation about the compound pharmacy market's actual structural position. Kyle's assumption, and the assumption embedded in the real compound pharmacy market, was that going around the insurance system and the branded pharmaceutical supply chain represented a genuine alternative. Source the ingredient yourself, mix it yourself, distribute it outside the official channels. The official channels cannot stop you because you are not inside them. What the show argues with the insurance agent in the truck is that this assumption was wrong. The supply chain for the raw ingredient was connected to the same institutional network that controlled the branded product. The workaround was not outside the system, it was a different part of the same system, and the system was aware of it. This is not literally what happened in the semaglutide compound pharmacy market, where the raw ingredient suppliers were genuinely separate from Novo Nordisk's supply chain, but it is a precise description of the structural relationship between the compound pharmacy market and the institutional forces that eventually closed it. The FDA's power to declare a shortage resolved and thereby eliminate the legal basis for compounding is itself a form of control over the alternative supply chain. The FDA is not a neutral arbiter of shortage determinations. Its decisions about when supply is sufficient are made in a context where branded pharmaceuticals pharmaceutical manufacturers have significant regulatory relationships with the agency and have interest in the timing and terms of those decisions. The compound pharmacy market existed because the official system's pricing and coverage decisions had made the official market inaccessible. The official system then used its regulatory authority to close the compound pharmacy market once the supply justification for it was no longer available. The patients who had been accessing medication through the compound market were not automatically transferred to affordable access through the official one. They were simply left without the option they had been using. What Kyle's operation and the real compound pharmacy market share at their core is a revelation about where the decision about who gets medicine actually lives. The decision lives with the institution. The drug works. The manufacturing process is not secret. The raw ingredient is available internationally at prices that make the branded markup visible as what it is. None of those facts change the outcome. The institution that controls pricing, coverage decisions, and ultimately the regulatory framework within which alternatives can legally exist determine what was available and to whom. Individual resourcefulness, whether deployed by a cartoon 9-year-old or by an industry of licensed pharmacies, operated within a space the institution defined and then closed when it chose to. The truck opened and the insurance agent was inside. The system was there the whole time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was the compound pharmacy market, how it grew, how it was closed, and what the episode's truck ending is actually saying about supply chain control. Next, the real economic ripple effects of GLP-1 drugs. What Ozempic is doing to the food industry, consumer spending, and the broader American economy, and why those effects are exactly what the cereal mascots were afraid of. Section 8. Randy Marsh and the people who don't need it. The show's other drug story. Randy Marsh is the character South Park uses when it wants to examine a uniquely American form of adult self-delusion. He is not stupid exactly, but he is reliably convinced that whatever he is currently doing makes sense, and that conviction always survives longer than the evidence for it. Parker and Stone have used him across the show's run to depict the gap between how middle-aged American men understand their own motivations and what those motivations actually are. He is the show's instrument for adult hypocrisy, and the choice to make him the central figure in the end of Obesity's B-plot is a precise one. The episode is not just about the people who need semaglutide and cannot get it. It is also about the people who do not need it and do. His entry into the semaglutide story begins with a visual observation that Randy frames as a moral concern. The mothers in his neighborhood, Sheila, Sharon's friends, the women in his social circle, have been taking semaglutide and have developed lean, toned bodies they are showing off in crop tops. Randy watches this and announces, with the particular confidence of a man who has already decided what he thinks, that exposed midriffs represent a problem he intends to address. His stated concern is that the mothers dressing this way will embarrass their daughters. His actual concern is evident from the scene's framing. He is attracted to what he is seeing and processing that attraction as civic alarm. He puts on his daughter's crop top to embarrass her into dressing more conservatively. The mothers, seeing him in the top, interpret it as participation rather than parody and invite him into their circle. He ends up at a semaglutide sharing party. Semaglutide, for Randy, is not a medical intervention. He does not have obesity. He does not have diabetes. He discovers that the drug suppresses appetite and produces weight loss without the hangover that alcohol leaves behind, which makes it, from his perspective, a superior recreational substance. He begins taking it for the same reason someone might switch from bourbon to a lower-calorie cocktail. It fits his lifestyle better and produces fewer morning consequences. The show is depicting something that was happening in the real world at scale. People without any clinical indication for semaglutide accessing it through social networks, telehealth platforms, or personal physicians for the purpose of cosmetic weight loss or lifestyle enhancement. Approximately a third of Ozempic prescriptions written in 2023 were for off-label weight loss in non-diabetic patients. Randy is that third, rendered as a recognizable cartoon of upper-middle-class male convenience. Suburban mothers in South Park taking semaglutide at sharing parties and displaying the results in crop tops is one of the episode's more specific social observations. The show is not mocking larger-bodied women wanting to lose weight. It is depicting a particular demographic of already thin enough, socially well-connected women accessing a medication at scale through networks and relationships rather than through clinical need. The real-world version of this dynamic was documented in media coverage throughout 2022 and 2023, as reports accumulated of semaglutide moving through social groups of wealthy women the way a good restaurant recommendation does. Someone tries it, loses weight visibly, gets asked about it, tells her friends, and the prescription spreads outward upward through a social network rather than downward through a medical one. The episode's mothers are not individually cruel or unusual. They are the expected outcome of a system in which the drug is available to people who can pay for it or access it socially before it is available to people like Cartman, who have a clearer clinical case but worse coverage. Withdrawal is the word the show reaches for when the government crackdown on semaglutide abuse removes the mothers from their supply, and the vocabulary is deliberate. Randy and the mothers do not simply feel inconvenienced when the supply stops. Their behavior escalates past inconvenience into something the episode frames as dependency. They begin robbing pharmacies. When pharmacy supply is exhausted, they turn to robbing Kyle and the boys, who have a manufactured supply of their own. Randy, the man who began the episode wearing a crop top to make a point about other people's clothing choices, is now participating in armed pharmaceutical robbery to maintain access to a drug he started taking because it was convenient at parties. The escalation is played as comedy. It is also a compressed depiction of what happens when any substance that produces a significant change in how a person feels is suddenly unavailable to the person using it. The craving the drug was suppressing does not disappear when the drug does. It returns, and it returns in proportion to how effective the suppression was. Sharon Marsh's subplot runs alongside Randy's and serves a different satirical purpose. Unable to afford Ozempic and denied coverage because she does not have diabetes, she is prescribed Lizzo by her doctor as the affordable alternative the insurance system will provide. The Lizzo prescription causes her to defecate from her ears. The show commits to this side effect across multiple scenes, deploying it with the particular commitment to gross out absurdism that the show is always treated as a legitimate comedic register. The ear-based defecation eventually produces a diagnosis, diabetes, an ear-specific form of diabetes that the doctor delivers with the same clinical tone he would use for any genuine diagnosis. Because Sharon now technically has a form of diabetes, the insurance company approves her semaglutide prescription. She gets the drug she was always eligible to receive medically through a route that required the cheaper alternative to damage her hearing system first. The show is describing, in the bluntest possible cartoon terms, the step therapy logic that real insurance systems apply. Try the cheap option, fail on the cheap option, develop a new condition as a consequence, use that condition to qualify for the expensive option. The route to coverage runs through iatrogenic harm. Pharmacy robberies in the episode's third act are not just action set pieces. They are the show's depiction of what happens when people who are accessing a drug recreationally or for vanity purposes are suddenly cut off, in the same moment that people who needed the drug medically are also trying to access it. Randy and the mothers are competing with Kyle and the boys for the same supply. Kyle's supply exists because Cartman cannot get the official supply. Randy's demand for the same supply exists because Randy liked how the drug felt at parties. The show has arranged these competing claims on the same limited resource to make a specific argument about how the shortage the episode is set inside actually worked. The scarcity that makes the boys' DIY operation necessary was created by demand that was not medically necessary. Randy is the vehicle for that demand. His addiction arc, recreational use, dependency, withdrawal, criminal escalation, is the episode's most pointed argument about who caused the shortage the boys are trying to solve. Near the end of the chase sequence, Randy has a realization. He has stolen the truck from the mothers to try to get the semaglutide to the boys. He is in the middle of a high-speed conflict involving cereal mascots, suburban mothers in drug withdrawal rage, and 4 children who have been running a pharmaceutical manufacturing operation out of what appears to be concern for their friend. Something about this panorama produces a moment of clarity for Randy. He decides the drug is bad. He arrives at this conclusion not through any structural analysis of the healthcare system, or any reckoning with his role in the shortage, or any thought about Cartman's situation. He arrives at it because the realization that Sharon was sympathetic about his desire to use the drug, that she was not angry when he confessed, made him feel that she was the coolest woman he knew. He decides semaglutide is bad because his marriage is intact. He invites her to a Holiday Inn to take MDMA like they did in college. This is Randy's version of moral growth, and the show presents it as entirely characteristic. He resolves a systemic problem by locating a personal resolution and walking away from the systemic problem unchanged. Between the mothers addicted to a drug they access socially and Randy concluding the drug is bad because his wife was understanding, the show has built a depiction of recreational and vanity semaglutide use that is more specific than a simple joke about people who do not need weight loss medication using it anyway. The critique is structural. Randy and the mothers access the drug because money and social connections made it available to them. Cartman could not access it because his coverage was denied. The show has placed these two sets of people in direct competition for the same supply, and the people who should not have needed the drug at all are the ones whose demand made the drug unavailable to the person who did. Randy's addiction arc and his sentimental resolution are the episode's sharpest illustration of how the GLP-1 access crisis was not simply a story about a greedy insurance system. It was also a story about a drug that was simultaneously in shortage for diabetics and abundant enough for wealthy non-diabetics to take recreationally at parties, because the shortage was not uniform. It was class-shaped. Some people could not find the drug at any price. Other people were taking it because it was good for parties. Real prescribing data from 2023 confirmed the demographic pattern the show was satirizing. GLP-1 users seeking weight loss rather than diabetes management skewed significantly younger and wealthier than those taking the drugs for their approved diabetic indication. Weight loss users were more likely to be privately insured or paying out of pocket, more likely to live in higher income zip codes, and more likely to be accessing the drug through telehealth platforms that streamlined the prescription process for people who had the time and financial comfort to navigate them. The diabetic users who were being displaced from supply by the weight loss demand surge were on average older, lower income, and more likely to be on public insurance plans that were already covering the drug before the shortage. The shortage redistributed the drug upward along income lines in a market that had not been designed to prevent that redistribution and had no regulatory mechanism to prioritize medical necessity over purchasing power. Parker and Stone make Randy's complete ignorance of all of this a feature rather than a bug. Randy does not know he is contributing to a shortage. He does not know that his party drug is a medication that people with diabetes depend on. He does not think about Cartman's situation at any point during his arc. He is not a villain. He is a man doing what the available systems make easy for him to do and experiencing no friction that would prompt him to examine it. The show does not ask the audience to hate Randy. It asks the audience to recognize him, which is more uncomfortable. Randy is presented as the logical product of a system that makes semaglutide available to people with money and connections before it makes it available to people with medical need. He did not design that system. He just lives in it, and the system works for him, and so he uses it. Sharon's recovery from diabetes, her ear returns to normal function, her coverage is approved, she gets the drug, and Randy's decision that the drug is bad happen in the same scene, and the show puts them next to each other deliberately. Sharon got what she needed through a route that required her to be harmed by the system's cheaper alternative first. Randy got what he wanted through social access, and then decided he did not want it anymore. The episode closes with both of them opting out of semaglutide for entirely personal reasons, while Cartman, who still does not have coverage and still does not have the drug, boards a plane to Pakistan. 3 characters, 3 different relationships with the same medication. One got it through wealth and social connection and gave it up by choice. One got it through iatrogenic harm and gave it up by choice. One never got it at all. The system that produced all 3 outcomes is identical. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was Randy's arc and what the episode is doing with recreational access versus clinical need. Next, the full side effect picture that the special skips, what the drug actually does to the body, what stopping it means, and the honest medical reality behind the thing Parker and Stone depicted as the solution the system was blocking. Section 9. What the show doesn't show. The medical reality behind the miracle drug. Nobody in the special gets sick from semaglutide. Cartman's appetite comes under control and the manufactured drug appears to be working. Randy loses weight and feels better at parties. The mothers in crop tops are thriving. The only character who experiences side effects is Sharon, and her side effects, defecating from her ears, developing diabetes, are the show's invented comedy rather than anything appearing in a clinical trial. This is a deliberate creative choice, not an oversight. Parker and Stone needed semaglutide to function as the obviously correct medical intervention being withheld by an uncaring system, and a drug that gives the protagonist nausea for 6 weeks, while his insurance company watches from across town would complicate that framing. The episode's argument depends on the drug being unambiguously good. The real drug is more complicated than that, and the complication matters not because it undermines the access argument the show makes, but because the access argument is only part of the picture. Around 44% of patients taking semaglutide experience nausea, according to FDA documentation. Vomiting affects approximately 25%. Diarrhea occurs in roughly 30% of users. Constipation and abdominal discomfort add to the profile. These figures come from the same clinical trials that produce the weight loss data the show implicitly references when Kyle's manufactured drug appears to be working on Cartman's appetite. The trials that showed 15 to 17% weight reduction over 68 weeks also recorded those gastrointestinal rates, and the two sets of numbers belong in the same conversation. Most patients find that GI symptoms diminish over the first 4 to 8 weeks as the body adapts to the dose escalation schedule, which deliberately starts low and increases gradually. For a significant minority, the symptoms do not fully resolve and require either dose reduction or stopping treatment entirely. Cartman in the special experiences none of this. The manufactured drug works cleanly. The real drug, for roughly a quarter to a third of patients, involves a significant period of physical discomfort before the weight loss results the episode is built around become the dominant experience. People who have taken the drug and stayed on it through the initial adjustment period consistently report something the clinical trial literature only partially captures. They describe the disappearance of what they call food noise, a constant background mental activity around eating that most of them did not recognize as extraordinary until it stopped. The persistent pull toward food, the thoughts cycling through when the next meal would be, what it would contain, the low-grade craving that operates across most of a person's waking hours. Patients describe this going quiet when semaglutide reaches therapeutic levels. Cartman's fantasy sequence at the start of the episode, where he imagines being thin and traveling to Pakistan to insult people without the fat-ass comeback available to his targets, is a fantasy about social freedom. The clinical experience that actual patients describe is different. It is cognitive relief. The drug removes a mental burden they had normalized to the point of invisibility. This subjective experience is part of why semaglutide compliance rates are higher than most previous obesity interventions. Patients stay on it because the absence of food noise is its own reward, independent of what the scale shows. The special's fantasy sequence imagines what thinness would mean socially. Real patients often describe what the drug does mentally before the body changes at all. Losing weight at the rate semaglutide produces creates a problem the show does not address, because Cartman never gets far enough into treatment to encounter it. When the body loses weight rapidly, that loss includes some reduction in lean mass alongside fat. Any weight loss method produces this, and the clinical goal is always to maximize fat loss while minimizing muscle loss through adequate protein intake and resistance exercise. What made semaglutide specific was the combination of its effectiveness and its appetite suppression mechanism. Patients were losing weight faster than most previous interventions had produced, and the same appetite suppression that drove the loss also reduced their drive to eat the protein that muscle maintenance requires. Research suggested that when total body weight fell by 15 to 20%, as seen in many trial participants, up to 40% of that loss could come from lean mass in patients who were not actively supplementing protein and maintaining resistance training. For older adults, muscle loss at that ratio carries consequences beyond body composition. Loss of muscle in older people correlates with increased fall risk, reduced mobility, and decreased functional independence. The episode never reaches this territory with Cartman because the plot removes his drug access before any of these longer-term dynamics could develop. Randy, who takes the drug recreationally and loses weight at whatever pace parties allow, is also never shown encountering this. Taking semaglutide indefinitely is where the show's central conflict would continue, even if the episode's resolution had gone differently. The Step 1 extension trial, which followed participants after medication was discontinued at the trial's end, found that participants regained approximately 2/3 of their lost weight within 1 year of stopping. Blood pressure, cholesterol, and blood sugar improvements that had developed during treatment began reversing within the same period. The appetite suppression, the slowed gastric emptying, the hormonal signals that had been producing the weight loss fade as the drug clears the system. Hunger returns to its previous level. The eating behaviors that felt manageable on the drug become harder without its pharmacological support. The medical community's response to this data has been to increasingly frame semaglutide not as a course of treatment with a defined endpoint, but as a chronic disease medication requiring indefinite use, comparable in its structure to antihypertensives or cholesterol-lowering drugs. This means the insurance problem Cartman faces at the start of the episode does not go away if he somehow gets one prescription filled. It recurs every month for the rest of his life. The show's framing of access as a single battle to be won understates the structural reality. Cartman would need coverage not once, but indefinitely, in a system that has already demonstrated it will deny him. Some patients experience effects from semaglutide that go beyond the GI symptoms that most public discussion focuses on. Gastroparesis, a slowing of gastric emptying severe enough to constitute a medical condition rather than a therapeutic effect, has been documented in case reports and clinical observations since semaglutide's widespread adoption began. The normal gastric stomach emptying that semaglutide slows as a feature of its satiety mechanism can, in some patients, slow to a degree that produces severe nausea, persistent vomiting, bloating, and an inability to eat without significant discomfort. Documented cases involved hospitalizations. Patients undergoing surgery were found, when anesthetized, to have food still present in their stomachs despite completing the required pre-anesthesia fast, creating aspiration risk that led to revised fasting guidelines for surgical patients taking GLP-1 drugs. The FDA added intestinal obstruction, ileus, and severe constipation, including fecal impaction, to the Ozempic label based on post-market reports. South Park's Sharon develops ear diabetes from the Lizzo prescription, a completely fictional side effect used for comic effect. The real, serious side effects are less funny and considerably more specific. 2 months after the special aired, a study published in JAMA Ophthalmology introduced a risk that had not been part of the mainstream conversation about semaglutide before. Researchers found that patients with type 2 diabetes or overweight who took semaglutide had significantly elevated risks of developing non-arteritic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy, known as NAION, a sudden painless loss of vision caused by reduced blood flow to the optic nerve. NAION is rare but can be permanent, with no established reversal treatment once it occurs. The relative risk elevation in the study was large enough to be clinically meaningful for prescribers evaluating patients with pre-existing optic nerve conditions or other visual risk factors. Legal coverage of the finding included patient accounts of permanent vision loss attributed to Ozempic use, with patients stating the known risk would have changed their treatment decisions. The FDA had been receiving adverse event reports related to vision changes since the drug's market adoption expanded, and NAION was among the categories under active review at the time the study published. The episode aired in May 2024. The NAION study appeared in July 2024. Parker and Stone were working with the information available to them. The information that became available 2 months later added a dimension to the drug's risk profile that was not part of the show's version of the story. Beyond the GI symptoms and the vision risk, a JAMA study comparing semaglutide users to users of another weight loss medication found statistically elevated risk of pancreatitis, bowel obstruction, and gastroparesis in the semaglutide group. These are not common events in absolute terms. The base rates for these conditions are low, and the elevated risk represents a small absolute probability increase rather than a large population-level event. Clinical perspective has generally been that semaglutide's cardiovascular, metabolic, and weight-related benefits outweigh the small elevated risks of these complications for most patients for whom the drug is indicated. The risk-benefit calculation is made at an individual level, factoring in each patient's existing conditions and risk factors. Patients with a personal or family history of medullary thyroid carcinoma or a diagnosis of multiple endocrine neoplasia syndrome type 2 are specifically excluded from semaglutide use per the drug's label due to a thyroid tumor signal observed in rodent studies during development. The clinical judgment that benefits outweigh risks is made at a specific moment with the evidence available at that moment. More evidence continues to arrive, and some of it modifies the judgment. Questions about decades of continuous GLP-1 receptor activation in the human body remain genuinely open because the drug has not existed long enough in widespread use to answer them. The clinical trials that established semaglutide's efficacy ran for 68 weeks. Long-term observational data is accumulating, but has not reached the depth that would give clinicians a complete picture of what 40 years of once-weekly injections produces in a patient who begins treatment at 35. The cardiovascular data from the SELECT trial provides strong evidence for short and medium-term cardiac benefit. What continuous GLP-1 receptor activation produces in the heart and vasculature over decades is less certain. The thyroid C-cell tumor signal from rodent studies has not translated into documented clinical cases at therapeutic doses in humans, but the black box warning remains on the label because the mechanism is physiologically plausible and the question has not been definitively settled at population scale. Medicine routinely adopts new drug classes before their long-term profiles are complete because the alternative, waiting for 40 years of data before treating patients with serious conditions, produces its own harms. The episode treats the drug as a fully known quantity being kept from the people who need it. The drug is a substantially known quantity with a genuinely impressive evidence base and some questions whose answers are still arriving. Sharon's side effects in the episode are the show's only engagement with what semaglutide does to a body that is not simple weight loss. Her Lizzo prescription makes her defecate from her ears. This is the show's comedic version of a side effect subplot, and it serves the insurance argument. not. The cheap alternative the system gives her causes harm. That harm qualifies her for the real drug. The system inadvertently treats her through its own dysfunction. What the show does not do is give any character a realistic adverse event from semaglutide itself. Cartman's manufactured drug works cleanly. Randy's recreational supply works cleanly. The mothers in their crop tops appear uniformly well on it. This is not a criticism of the episode as a piece of satire, because the episode's argument requires the drug to be the thing the system is withholding rather than something with its own complications. But placing Sharon's comedy side effects from the fake drug next to the complete absence of real side effects from the real drug creates an asymmetry. The episode satirizes the body positivity alternative as causing ear-based diabetes. The drug that is the episode's hero causes nausea in 44% of users, potential gastroparesis in a smaller subset, and a documented risk of permanent vision loss that appeared in published research 2 months after the episode aired. Homemade semaglutide in the real world carried risks that Kyle's operation, as depicted, does not acknowledge. The FDA's concerns about the compound pharmacy market were not about whether the active ingredient was real. They were about sterility, dosing concentration, and unlisted additives. Inspections of real compounding facilities found sterility issues and concentration errors, patients receiving more or less semaglutide than their label stated, and unlisted additives including various forms of B vitamins that had not been part of any clinical trial. The boys mixed their compound in what appears to be a domestic setting, with raw ingredient purchased from an Indian factory and biostatic water from a local supplier. The episode does not pause on what happens if the concentration is wrong or the mixing is not sterile. It does not need to, because the plot needs the drug to work well enough for the story to function. In the real compound pharmacy market, the concentration being wrong was documented. The sterility being compromised was documented. Patients who accessed compounded semaglutide through unverified sources were taking on quality risks that the clinical trials establishing the drug's efficacy did not include. None of this dismantles the access argument that sits at the center of the special's 50 minutes. The drug works. The evidence for its efficacy in weight management and cardiovascular protection is among the strongest any pharmaceutical product in this space has ever generated. The insurance system's coverage decisions were not primarily driven by the side effect profile or the open long-term questions. They were driven by cost and by the historical classification of obesity as a condition undeserving of pharmaceutical coverage. Kyle's speech in the cafeteria calling out the sugar industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the insurance companies as coordinated forces operating against individual health is an accurate diagnosis of structural conditions that exist in the real world. The special gets the power dynamics right. What it skips is the clinical reality that the drug it is defending is not a simple miracle being kept from people who need it, but a genuine medical advance with a documented side effect profile, an open long-term question set, and a stopping problem that converts every access victory into an ongoing access requirement. Semaglutide is the best pharmacological intervention obesity medicine has ever produced. It is also a once-weekly injection that causes nausea in nearly half its users, may carry a small risk of permanent vision loss, and produces weight regain in 2/3 of patients within a year of stopping. The show needed it to be simpler than that, and the satire works because the access argument is real. The fuller picture is also real, and it lives alongside the episode rather than against it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was the medical reality the episode skips, and why it matters alongside the access argument the show makes. Next, the class politics of thinness in America, the long history that made Ozempic's access gap inevitable, and why the body has always been a record of the systems a person can afford to enter. Section 10. South Park's most unusual episode. What End of Obesity does that the show almost never does. Trey Parker has said, across multiple interviews over the years, that the thing he hates most in television is when a show gets preachy. He and Matt Stone built South Park on a specific creative principle: mock everything, take nobody's side, and never let any character deliver a lesson that the show endorses without immediately undercutting it. This is not just an aesthetic preference. It is the structural engine of how the show generates its particular kind of comedy. The joke is usually that everyone is wrong. The liberal character is wrong in a liberal direction. The conservative character is wrong in a conservative direction. The child who figures out the truth delivers the truth in a context that makes the truth useless. The credits roll. Nothing changes. This is not nihilism for its own sake. It is a formal commitment to a specific satirical worldview, that the problem is never one side, and that any character who thinks they have the answer Sugar, is probably the next episode's target. End of Obesity is the most significant departure from that principle that the show has produced in years, and understanding what makes it different requires understanding how consistently Parker and Stone have held to it across 27 seasons before this episode came along. South Park's history on politically contested topics is one of deliberate double mockery. An episode about gun control will mock gun control advocates and gun rights advocates in roughly equal measure. An episode about climate change will ridicule both the people who deny the science and the people who treat the science as a license for self-righteous performance. An episode about race will mock the people who refuse to acknowledge racism and the people who weaponize the concept of racism for personal advantage. Parker and Stone have described this as their natural temperament. They are, by their own account, people who get irritated by certainty from any direction. And South Park is what happens when two people with that temperament spend 27 years making a cartoon about American public life. The show's audience has always been heterogeneous in political terms, which is partly a function of this approach. Conservatives watch South Park because it mocks liberals. Liberals watch South Park because it mocks conservatives. Both groups are periodically made uncomfortable by an episode that mocks them specifically. This is a difficult equilibrium to maintain for 27 years, and the show has not always maintained it perfectly, but it has been the governing principle far more often than it has been abandoned. Equal opportunity mockery in practice means that the show's endings rarely endorse anyone. Parker has specifically cited South Park's Season 9 episode Trapped in the Closet, which satirized Scientology, as an example of an episode that went after a target so aggressively that it felt like the show was actually taking a position. He expressed discomfort with episodes that feel like they are rooting for an outcome. The show's most characteristic ending structure involves a character, usually Stan or Kyle, delivering a speech that sounds like a lesson, followed by circumstances that immediately demonstrate the lesson's inadequacy. Or the speech is correct, but nobody listens. Or the speech changes interpersonal behavior without touching the structural problem. Or the character delivering the speech has been wrong about something adjacent to the lesson, which undercuts their authority as a moral voice. The lesson lands and then slides off. The audience laughs at the landing and the sliding both. Political episodes from the show's middle seasons cemented this structure as something viewers expected. The 2004 episode Douche and Turd, in which the school's election comes down to a choice between a giant douche and a turd sandwich, set a template the show returned to repeatedly. Any election, any political choice, framed as a selection between two equally inadequate options, with the person who abstains on principle punished for the abstention, and the person who engages unable to improve the outcome. The season 20 storyline built around the 2016 presidential election collapsed famously when the show had bet heavily on a Clinton win, and the actual result made the plot irrelevant. Parker and Stone subsequently said they had exhausted what they could say about Donald Trump and deliberately avoided the 2024 election cycle. Their stated reason was not cowardice, but fatigue. The political figure had become too silent to satirize effectively, because parody could not get further from reality than reality had already gone. In each of these instances, the show's discomfort was with being asked to produce a clear argument, to stand somewhere and say that somewhere was right. Standing in front of his elementary school classmates and delivering a speech about sugar companies, pharmaceutical companies, and insurance companies conspiring against individual health, Kyle Broflovsky does something the show almost never lets its characters do successfully. He delivers the lesson, and it lands. The camera does not cut to a contradicting reaction. The classmates do not mock him. His teacher does not undermine him. The speech is received with agreement. This is unusual enough in South Park's grammar that it registers as a departure. Kyle is the show's designated moral voice, the character most likely to be right about the ethical dimension of any situation. But across 27 seasons, the show has consistently made his rightness either useless or immediately qualified. He is right and nobody cares. He is right and the situation resolves before his rightness can matter. He is right and Cartman exploits the rightness for purposes Kyle did not intend. The cafeteria speech in End of Obesity plays differently. Parker and Stone appear to mean it. Boarding a plane to Pakistan is what Cartman does immediately after Kyle's speech secures the no fat shaming pledge, and the show's defenders have argued that this ending undercuts the speech sufficiently to maintain the show's traditional refusal to endorse anything. The pledge backfires. Kyle's moral growth becomes a tool Cartman exploits. The lesson produced an outcome nobody intended. This reading is not wrong. The Cartman ending is consistent with the show's normal grammar, but what makes End of Obesity different from a standard South Park episode is not the ending alone. It is the totality of what the show builds before the ending. The sugar cartel mascots are villains without complexity. The insurance company is a villain without redemption. The body positivity alternative is a fake drug with ear-based diabetes as a side effect. Every element of the episode's satirical architecture points in the same direction. Previous South Park episodes built their satirical architecture to point in multiple directions simultaneously, so the ending could plausibly deflate all of them at once. End of Obesity builds its architecture to point at specific institutional targets, and the ending does not deflate the critique of those targets. It deflates Kyle's interpersonal solution while leaving the institutional critique entirely intact. Stone and Parker, speaking to Vanity Fair in 2024 around the time the special was being produced, described themselves as tired of doing South Park through presidential election cycles. They specifically cited the cognitive exhaustion of trying to maintain equal mockery of political figures whose behavior had become difficult to parody because reality was already doing the work. What they were describing, without using the word, was the challenge of equal opportunity satire in an environment where the targets have become unequal in their extremity. End of Obesity represents a response to that challenge that does not involve a presidential election. The target is not a political figure who can be mocked from both sides. The target is an insurance coverage decision, a food industry lobbying strategy, and a drug pricing structure. These are not targets that the show's traditional equal opportunity framework handles easily, because there is no liberal version of insurance companies denying coverage to obese patients and a conservative version of insurance companies denying coverage to obese patients that can be mocked simultaneously. The situation has a direction. The show, working in its 50-minute special format with more time to develop an argument than a 22-minute weekly episode allows, chose to go in that direction. 6 days is how long a standard South Park episode takes to produce from concept to broadcast. Parker and Stone have maintained this production schedule across most of the show's run as both a practical necessity and a creative philosophy. The tight schedule forces simplicity. An episode has to be built around one idea developed quickly, not multiple ideas developed carefully. The 6-day window selects for satire that makes one large, legible point rather than a complex, layered argument, because complexity requires time that the schedule does not provide. The Paramount Plus special format removes that constraint. End of Obesity had a production timeline that, while not publicly specified, was categorically different from the 6-day weekly turnaround. The special is 50 minutes long, features multiple parallel subplots with distinct tonal registers, includes a set-piece action sequence with a large number of animated characters operating simultaneously, and makes an argument that has several interconnected layers. None of that is possible in 6 days. The format change enabled a different kind of episode, and the episode the format enabled is one in which Parker and Stone had enough time to actually build an argument rather than simply identify a target. Regular South Park episodes operate on a target and deflate model. Find the thing that is stupid or hypocritical about current events, build a cartoon around the stupidity, deflate it in the final act. The Paramount Plus special model, which South Park has been using since the post-COVID specials in 2021, has consistently produced episodes with more structural complexity than the weekly format allows. The Streaming Wars specials use the longer format to develop a Randy Marsh storyline, with enough room to make its point without rushing the punchline. Joining the Panderverse built a Disney satirical universe that required setup time the weekly format could not have accommodated. End of Obesity uses the format most ambitiously of the specials produced under the Paramount Plus deal, because its argument about access, class, insurance, pharmaceutical pricing, the food industry, and the limits of body positivity as a response to structural healthcare failures requires each of those elements to be developed enough to carry its portion of the satirical weight. A 22-minute episode could have made one of those points. The 50-minute special makes all of them, interconnects them, and arrives at an ending that is coherent precisely because the argument was given enough space to develop. Paramount Plus changed what South Park could be in ways that the network was probably not fully anticipating when it signed the original $900 million deal with Parker and Stone in 2021. The deal was framed publicly as a film deal, 14 feature films, 2 per year, and Parker and Stone subsequently clarified that the studio had chosen to characterize the projects as films without consulting them, and that the projects were special episodes rather than theatrical features. But the framing, even the corrected framing, positioned these projects as something different from regular South Park. They were events. They were destinations on a streaming platform rather than scheduled stops in a weekly broadcast. This changed what an audience brought to them. Viewers arriving at a 50-minute South Park special on a streaming platform have made an active choice to be there, in a way that a viewer catching a regular episode in its broadcast slot has not. The special model is closer to going to see a movie than it is to watching television, and End End of Obesity uses that attention differently than a weekly episode would. Putting himself on semaglutide for the purposes of making the special is the detail about Parker's involvement that distinguishes End of Obesity from every previous South Park episode about weight, drugs, or healthcare. Parker is not just the satirist commenting on a pharmaceutical trend. He is a participant in the pharmaceutical trend being satirized. This is not unprecedented in comedy. Comedians making work about personal experience is the foundation of the form. But it is unusual for South Park specifically, which has historically maintained a studied distance between Parker and Stone's personal lives and the show's subject matter. The opening disclaimer, announcing that viewers will hear Parker actually injecting himself, puts the creator's body into the text of the episode before any story has begun. It signals that whatever follows is not the detached, equal opportunity mockery of something Parker has observed from outside. It is the work of someone who has taken the drug he is satirizing and has opinions about what the drug is, what the drug does, and why the drug is not more accessible than it currently is. After End of Obesity, South Park's production situation became more complicated than the special's reception suggested it would. Parker and Stone's relationship with Paramount became strained through 2024 and into 2025. Season 27 was delayed by disputes over the Paramount and Skydance merger, with Parker and Stone publicly describing the merger as interfering with South Park's production and accusing incoming Paramount leadership of meddling in their contract negotiations. The season, originally scheduled for July 9th, 2025, was pushed to July 23rd. Hours before its premiere, Parker and Stone signed a new 5-year deal with Paramount, valued at approximately $1.5 billion, covering 50 new episodes. The deal made Paramount Plus the global streaming home for the show's library and all new episodes. Season 27, when it arrived, addressed topics including a Diddy satire, a Trump storyline that ran across multiple episodes, and material that demonstrated the show was still operating in its familiar territory of rapid response cultural commentary. The End of Obesity special remained, within that context, an outlier, the most sustained and architecturally committed piece of healthcare satire the show had produced. The episode where Parker and Stone chose direction over their usual equilibrium. 27 seasons of the same rule: mock everyone equally, take nobody's side, let the ending deflate the lesson. That rule always worked because every target had two sides worth hitting. End of Obesity found a target that did not. There is no defensible version of an insurance company handing a child a motivational music prescription instead of actual medicine. No second angle exists. So Parker and Stone dropped the framework and made an argument instead. The cereal mascots had guns. The insurance company won. Kyle was right. Cartman went to Pakistan. The show knew who the villain was, said so plainly, and did not walk it back. After 27 years of equal opportunity chaos, that clarity felt like something different. It felt, for 50 minutes, like South Park had finally gotten angry about the right thing. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.